I was originally asked to speak on the subject, creating a new mindset. That's what the committee told me. They said, talk on creating a new mindset. And I'm not the kind of person that likes the word mindset. I never liked that word. When did you first hear that word? Like in the late 70s? I don't like to share the experience, and I don't like to have quality time, and I don't like mindset and things like that. So I said, is that really what you want me to talk on? And they said, yes, we want you to talk on the subject of the book by Paul Lampol called Creating a New Mindset. And I was very happy when I heard that, because Paul Lampol never wrote a book called Creating a New Mindset. Okay. He wrote a book called Creating a New Mind, which is the same thing, pretty much. Wouldn't you agree? So I was very happy. And I went and I read the book by Paul Lampol called Creating a New Mind. And I can tell you right now that there's no way in 3 sessions that you could cover all the material in that book. It's a brilliant book. How many of you have read it? Okay, so that's very good. How many of you have a new mind since you read that book? How many of you are out of your mind? So, yeah, okay, good. Okay, even those that hadn't read the book. But in that book, he basically describes 3 arenas in which change needs to take place in the Baha'i community. And those arenas are the individual, institutions, and the community. And within each of those 3, I think he has 12 to 15 chapters in which he describes the various ways in which change must take place in the Baha'i community. I think that if you had 10 or 12 lectures on that, you still couldn't cover the material. So I'm just not going to do it. Rather, I decided to look at the concept of changing your mind in the Baha'i writings to see what the basic principles are, and see if we can't come to some method, some easy method that can enable us to have a new mind. You may realize that the whole principle of the Baha'i revelation is transformation and change. If you wanted to just completely summarize what the theme is of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, you could say it's about transformation and change of civilization, of mankind, of culture, of the world. That really is the fundamental principle of the Baha'i faith, is that the world is in need of transformation and change. If you don't believe me, go and look at the very first paragraph of the introduction by Shoghi Effendi to God Passes By. Because if you think about it, God Passes By is Shoghi Effendi's complete history of the whole early part of the Baha'i faith. And he had to write an introduction to that. So what is Shoghi Effendi going to say in the introduction to this? And I'm going to read you what Shoghi Effendi says in the introduction to God Passes By. He says, the weight of the potentialities which this faith, possessing no peer or equal in the world's spiritual history, and marking the culmination of a universal prophetic cycle, has been endowed. He says the weight with which it has been endowed staggers our imagination. Already in the space of less than a century, the operation of the mysterious process generated by its creative spirit has provoked a tumult in human society such as no mind can fathom. It has, through the emergence of its slowly crystallizing system, induced a fermentation in the general life of mankind, designed to shake the very foundations of a disordered society, to purify its lifeblood, to reorient and reconstruct its institutions, to shape its final destiny. Can you believe that? He says that the potentialities of this revelation staggers our imagination. It's induced a fermentation in the general life of mankind. He goes on for 3 more paragraphs on this theme. He talks about, and I'm not going to read it, he talks about how there has been this worldwide upheaval as a result of the Baha'i revelation, and he says that this planetary upheaval has deranged the equilibrium of the world. He says that there is a world-shaking, world-energizing, world-redeeming spirit that Baha'u'llah brought into the world, and it is, quote, vibrating in the inmost reality of all things. Okay, is that not change and transformation such as the world has never seen? That is the theme. Now, it seems to me that then we each have to figure out how can we change. How similar are we to the human beings that lived on this planet before this revelation, and how much transformation have we gone through ourselves yet? Obviously, we have not fulfilled the kind of transformation that Baha'u'llah wants to see for the world or for us. But Baha'u'llah promises that there is the possibility for you to have a new mind. And I want to read this to you. It's from the Kitab-i-Iqan, and Baha'u'llah says that if you do a few things, actually not a few, it's 25 things, if you want to know, I counted them. Okay. But if you do 25 things, and if you want, I can list you the 25, because I counted them. He says, if you do 25 things, and then on top of that, if you are really, really enthusiastic, and you do the 25 things, and you're enthusiastic, this is what will happen to you. He says, then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the Holy and Everlasting Spirit confer such new life upon that seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation. Isn't that an amazing promise? You do these 25 things, you will have a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, a new mind, and you will see in every atom of creation doors that lead to the knowledge of God. This is Baha'u'llah's promise in the Kitab-i-Iqan. Now, how many of you would like to have that new mind that Baha'u'llah is talking about? 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Okay. So what I want to do is then see if there's a way in which we can develop a path for this, some kind of surefire method. You know, the human soul doesn't come with a user's manual, but actually it does. The user's manual is the hidden words. The user's manual is the Kitab-i-Iqan. It's Baha'u'llah's writings. It does come with a user's manual. How many of you people get something and try to work it and don't read the manual? I'm like, oh, okay, you're all playing. We're all kind of like that. We just want to start doing it. I think that's pretty much what all of us are doing with our mind and our spirit. We're trying to use it, and we haven't taken time to read the manual. And if you read the manual, you can use it a whole lot better, and maybe you can achieve what Baha'u'llah says here in the Kitab-i-Iqan. So what I want to do is look in the Baha'i writings and see what are the principles for human transformation, personal human transformation. In other words, Paul Lample talked about the individual and the institutions and the community. I'm only going to look at the first part, the individual, and I'm not even going to look like he did at what the things we need to transform to. I only want to look at the process by which we can transform to those things. But before I do this, I want to mention, oh, Darren, I'm glad you're here. Darren's going to have to help me because Darren is a physicist, right? Okay. And I've been talking to him a lot because last year I gave a course pretty much on science and religion, and Darren pointed out all the things that I said wrong last year. So I made sure to... No, that's not true. No, he didn't do that. But he's a physicist, and I want to mention two principles. One comes from physics, and one comes from psychology. Two principles, and I want to mention these first so we understand them, and then I'm going to go to the Baha'i writings. And the reason I mention these two things first is that they very closely correspond to the fundamental principles of change and transformation in the Baha'i writings. The first concept comes from physics, and it has to do with the idea that we only can understand truth, and we can only understand anything if we understand its frame of reference. How many of people have heard the term frame of reference used in physics? If you work in physics or in any branch of the physical sciences, you understand that a frame of reference is required to understand something. Now, if you don't know the frame of reference, then you really can't understand too much. Now, there are many kinds of frames of reference in physics, and I asked Darren last night how many there were, and he said there were countless. Is that what you said to me? So I wanted to mention all of them, and now I can't because Darren is here. But some of them have to do with things, you're stationary and nothing is moving. Like, for example, we say, I can't see the forest from the trees. That's stationary, but you can see that when you see the trees, you have one frame of reference where you are, and if you're the forest, you have another one. Others have to do with things that are moving. Okay, and as things move, depending on what they're moving, you have a different frame of reference. If I were to hold a bar right up here, like a long bar like this, and you looked at it, you might say it's a big long bar. If you were over here and you looked at it, you might say it's a dot. Would you agree? Because your frame of reference is different. So things are different. Truth is actually different according to your frame of reference. Likewise, if you're moving, say for example, I'm in a convertible car, driving 60 miles an hour, I might say that there's wind if I reach outside. Is there wind? From your frame of reference there is, but what about if you're outside the car? There's no wind. The wind was created by your movement. It depends on your frame of reference. Likewise, if a fly was in a train, let's say you're in a train going at 60 miles an hour and a fly goes past you at 1 mile an hour, how fast is the fly moving? Okay, well, it's very simple. The fly is moving at 1 mile an hour to the frame of reference of the person sitting on the train. But to the person outside, how fast is the fly moving? 60 miles an hour. But the Earth is spinning. How fast is it spinning? Okay, and then the spinning Earth is rotating, okay, and then the galaxy is rotating, so there's movement upon movement upon movement, and so there's many, many different frames of reference. So Einstein extended this even to time. Time and space even changes according to your frame of reference. Now, we can't go into this. In fact, I think I would like Darren to maybe give a talk on this. That just as in physics or science, that human beings also have frames of reference. And that every human being is right according to their own frame of reference. Nobody is ever wrong. If you sit at the table and talk to somebody and they have some opinion that's different to yours, you must say to yourself immediately, that person is right according to his or her frame of reference. And it's only that their frame of reference differs from mine that we have any difference of idea. Now, it logically follows then that you can't change someone's mind. You can only change their frame of reference, and then the mind actually just follows. Likewise, you can't change yourself unless you change your frame of reference. It's just a very natural thing. And often a frame of reference change can bring about sudden knowledge. For example, the astronauts said that when they first went into space and they looked at the Earth, they just looked at it and suddenly they had a completely different concept of mankind, civilization, history, sociology, psychology, everything in a single image. They didn't read books, they didn't read psychology, anything. Just a single frame of reference change caused dramatic mind change. Would you agree? We all go through this. Now, if you look in the Baha'i writings, you'll find that many times Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, or Shoghi Effendi calls us to change our frame of reference rather than telling us exactly what to believe. For example, Baha'u'llah says, let your vision be world-embracing rather than confined to your own self. Notice he didn't say what to believe. He didn't say think this, think that, think this. He just said change your vision. Abdu'l-Baha said, quote, in this wondrous revelation, in this glorious century, the foundations of the faith of God and the distinguishing feature of his law is the consciousness of the oneness of mankind. Now, isn't that interesting that he used the consciousness of the one? In other words, he didn't say oneness of mankind is something you should believe in. He said you have to have a consciousness of it. Is that not a change in your frame of reference? that Abdu'l-Baha is calling. Now, if you become aware of this concept, you will read so much of Shoghi Effendi, so much of Abdu'l-Baha, and you'll realize that he's calling us to change our perspective, our frame of reference. In fact, we know that if you look at something from a different frame of reference, you can often understand it or solve the problem. Darren told me that in physics, they often purposefully try and find a different frame of reference because one of them will solve the problem, and the other one, you can't even understand the problem. Is that correct? Is that what you told me? He said basically that the problem becomes much easier to solve if you change your frame of reference. Now, this is interesting because we're told in Baha'i consultation to try and really understand everyone's opinion. But what you really need to do is put yourself in their frame of reference. And sometimes a solution to a problem will occur to you only when you put themselves in that frame of reference. You know, there's an old saying that says, before criticizing someone, walk a mile in their shoes. Because then, when you do criticize them, they're a mile away from you, and you have and you have their shoes. You see? Okay. Which is very, very true. But also, it's just a basic expression of the idea of a change of frame of reference. Many times the arts, literature, drama, theater, will change our frame of reference without actually preaching. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln met the novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe in the White House. And it's been widely reported, although it sounds a little fishy to me, but it's reported in many, many books, that Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he said, "So this is the little lady that started this big war?" And the reason is that he knew that she had written the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was so influential in the North in changing the attitude towards slavery that Abraham Lincoln blamed the whole Civil War, all 500,000 deaths and everything else. He blamed it on this little lady that wrote a book. And yet history, if you read it, you'll find that indeed that book did it. Yet that book was not an essay, it was not a lecture on slavery, it was not a debate, it was not anything. In fact, it only was telling the story of one particular slave. But it so changed the frame of reference that it, according to Abraham Lincoln, started a war and ended slavery. This is how things can happen. Now, I noticed something very interesting in Shoghi Effendi's life. Something Shoghi Effendi did in 1930. Does anyone know what Shoghi Effendi did in 1930? No, he didn't do everything, actually. He did one thing in 1930, and it's not only interesting that he did it, it's when he did it. Okay, in 1930, he writes a letter. He writes a letter actually in March 1931 to Martha Root and says what he's been doing for the last 8 months. And he writes, "I have just completed, after 8 months of continuous and hard labor, the translation of the history of the early days of the cause, and sent the manuscript to the American National Assembly. The work comprises about 600 pages, 200 pages of additional notes that I have gleaned during the summer months from different books. I have been so absorbed in this work that I have been forced to delay my correspondence. I am now so tired and exhausted that I can hardly write. The record is an authentic one and deals chiefly with the Bab. Parts of it have been read to Baha'u'llah and revised by Abdu'l-Baha. I am so overcome with fatigue caused by the long and severe strain of the work I have undertaken that I must now stop and lie down." And what was he talking about? The translation of the book we call the Dawnbreakers. 8 months, night and day, he did this. Now, you'd say, well, what's so interesting about that? The interesting about that is that in that same year, he started to translate the Kitab-i-Khan. But apart from that, The Guardian had done nothing else in terms of major book translation, according to Riyakanum. Gleanings came later. Prayers and meditations came later. All of his books, God Passes By, and they all came later. Why did he do the Dawnbreakers first? Why did Shoghi Effendi, and why did he take 8 months non-stop to do it? Furthermore, he didn't even launch any teaching plans until after this. Riyakunim says that, the Shoghi Effendi had to prosecute the tablets of the divine plan. And that was one of his main goals. He didn't do that. So all of the things that you think the Guardian had to do, translate all these writings, prosecute teaching plans, first thing he does is he say, before I do any of that, I need to translate the Dawnbreakers. So he does. And then he writes in October of 31, he says, I urge all English-speaking believers to concentrate studying Nabil's immortal narrative as an essential preliminary to the renewed intensive teaching campaign. I strongly feel widespread use of its varied, rich, and authentic material constitutes the most effective weapon to meet the challenge of this critical hour. I unhesitatingly recommend it to every prospective visitor to Baha'u'llah's native land. And Riyakunim then goes on to write that the reason Guardian did this was that he knew he was going to have to call on the believers to do these teaching plans. And he knew that he couldn't do it until they had a change of their frame of reference, which only the Dawnbreakers can give. It's not possible to read the Dawnbreakers without changing your frame of reference in a profound way. Shoghi Effendi was going to call on the believers to sacrifice. But maybe what they thought of sacrifice was that they might, give up a Thursday night to go to a tea and social or something. Maybe that's what they thought sacrifice would have meant. But not when you read the Dawnbreakers. Would you agree? How many of you have read the Dawnbreakers and had a change of frame of reference? Absolutely. So you can see that even in the actions of Shoghi Effendi, he understood the principle that you must have a change in the frame of reference. Now recently I read an analysis of the work of Albert Einstein. And all of us are familiar that Einstein was just immensely productive. In 1905 he wrote 4 papers that completely revolutionized science. And most people that study his life say his method was based on imagination or visualization or what we call thought experiments, that this was his technique. And they say his technique was based on imagination or visualization. But recently it has been discovered that Einstein had a very simple technique that he applied to every problem that he discovered. And that technique was that he tried to imagine himself in the frame of reference of some part of what he was thinking about. So if he was thinking about light or gravity, he imagined he was traveling and he was a beam of light or traveling alongside it or something. He tried to put himself in another frame of reference. And when he got there, he saw things in a different way. So definitely changing your frame of reference has an effect. So this is the first principle. You cannot change your mind if you don't change your frame of reference. So we need to know how we can change our frame of reference. The second concept that I want to mention before I go to the Baha'i writings is what we call the concept of inattentional blindness. And this is quite a popular field of study now in psychology. How many of you have read about it at all? Go and look in the internet and type inattentional blindness, particularly in the 90s. And right now, there's universities all over the world that are conducting studies in this. And basically what they found is that the human being, the human mind or the human perceptional ability is not as good as we thought. In fact, it's nowhere near as good as we thought. And many things that are very easy to see, we don't see. Very easy to see, we don't see. And we don't see them for various reasons. There's 3 categories of reasons, but I'll describe to you some of the research that led to understanding. The first research that was done, the first test was done, it was published and it was ridiculed throughout the scientific community because it wasn't believed. Because what he did was he took basketball players, 5 of them, and they passed basketballs and they videotaped it. And the basketball was passing, and he put a group of subjects in front of it and said, count the passes of the basketball players. And they would count 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30, I don't know how many. But at some point, as they were counting, a woman in a ballet costume with an umbrella walked in between. making sure that she went in front of some, behind the others, and they were still counting the passes. And then he would bring these subjects together and say, how many passes did you count? And someone would say 97 passes or whatever. Did you notice anything unusual? No, I counted 97 passes. You didn't see a woman with an umbrella and ballet costume going through? No. Now, you can get this original video that he showed, and you can see it as clear as can be. It's like, how could you miss that? Consequently, it was assumed that he had falsified his data, or that he had done something wrong, or it's some way in which it was tainted. And later on, the test was conducted many other times. And one of the most famous tests had to do with a gorilla costume. And you can also see this on the internet. And you can even see the people taking tests. And what they did is they put someone in a gorilla costume, and a really good one. It just looks like even a gorilla would know the difference. It was a really good. Okay. And before they did anything, they said, let's make sure that this is a noticeable thing. So they took the person in a gorilla costume, walked it down the street, and everybody noticed it. Cars would stop, they would honk. Even one time they got arrested by the police. The gorilla got arrested by the police. The gorilla said, how fast was I going? I don't know, something like that. Okay. But it was quite obvious that this was a very strange, unusual thing, a gorilla walking around the street. So he makes a video in which he takes a highway that has 2 or 3 lanes going this way and 2 or 3 lanes going that way. So it's more lanes and a meridian strip down the middle. And the cars are going in both directions, and he plays the video for his subjects. And in the study I saw, they were all university students. And he says, count the cars going along there. Make sure you count every car. 1, 2, 3. And they're counting the cars in both directions. And as they're counting the cars, a gorilla walks completely along the meridian strip. In front of some of the cars they're counting, behind some of the cars they're counting. Now, in this particular test, and you can see it, there's a documentary made on it, they interview these are all university students, and they say, how many cars did you count? And they say 120, I don't know, whatever, they say how many. Did you notice anything unusual? No, nothing unusual. Now, he'd already shown you the video. It was a gorilla walking up the street. It's so easy to see. And they didn't see it. Every single one of them didn't see it. Usually it's about 70% on statistic don't see it. But in this particular test, everyone didn't see it. So then they say, there was a gorilla that walked, up that street while you were counting the cars. I said, no way. Well, let me play you the video. They play the video. Then the person says, I'm sorry, but that is not the video that you showed me. They refuse even to believe it. And other studies have been done in this way, and they found that you are blind to certain things if you are looking at something else. Human perception is not what we think it is. Even though the visual cortex and light and everything that we know about vision, it doesn't get there for some reason. Now, Baha'u'llah constantly refers to the fact that you can't see the spiritual world if you don't not look at the physical world. If you don't, he says, close one eye and open the other. He constantly refers to the principle of inattentional blindness in relation to the physical and spiritual world. But science has found that there are 3 ways in which you can be blind to truth. One is you can be busy doing something else, and so you miss something. That's the kind that we just talked about. That's one form of inattentional blindness. Another form of inattentional blindness has to do with what you expect. And if something happens that you don't expect, you often don't see it. So they'll do studies where, a certain person will hear the phone ring on a video, and then they'll go and answer it and reach it and answer it, and they say hello, but in fact they switched it. It's a different person answering the phone. He's got different color hair and 50-60% don't realize, because they don't expect a person as they reach for a phone to transform into another person. Okay, so you don't expect it, you don't see it. They also found that you can become blind if you have knowledge or experience. Knowledge and experience blinds you. Now, this is a very strange thing, because we think knowledge and experience makes you better at something. How can knowledge and experience make you blind? Now, we know as Baha'is this is true, because Baha'u'llah says, if you want to recognize spiritual truth, you have to empty yourself of all learning. But science has discovered this is the case. And NASA was particularly alarmed when they conducted a test, not too long ago in fact, in which they had space shuttle trained pilots landing in a simulator. In other words, it was just like they were really landing, but it was a simulator. And they were ones that had landed the space shuttle before, experienced NASA space shuttle landing pilots. And they would have them land, but in the simulator, they would put things on the runway that didn't belong there, like people and cars and stuff. And they found that more than a quarter of all the trained NASA pilots landed right on the people or right on the things. Okay, they didn't do it. And then they tried people that weren't experienced at landing, but could taught them to use a simulator, and not one of them landed on the obstructions. And NASA was confused. How could this be so? Our trained pilots don't see something that untrained people do. And this and many other studies have shown that knowledge, experience, or what you expect can cause blindness. Now, we're going to find that this has deep spiritual implications and relates to almost everything that Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah said. This is why I'm mentioning it. So that's another thing that causes blindness. The third thing that they say causes blindness is gradual change. Gradual change, for some reason, is very hard to see. They do studies in which even over 30 seconds, they'll show a picture. If I actually have these on video if you ever want to see them. They show a picture, and over 30 seconds, something will change in the picture, but gradually. A whole building will appear, or a color of something will change, and so on. And usually 50, 60, 70% can't get it if it changes in 30 seconds. Now, if they do the same change instantaneously, you see it immediately. Okay, for some reason, gradual change is hard to see. This is why it's very important that in addition to watching something, you have to take incremental measures of something, once a day or once a year or something, because gradual change is hard to see. All of these three ways show you that human perception is not as good as we think. So we have two ideas here that I want to now relate to the Baha'i writings. One is that frame of reference is the only way that you can change your mind, changing your frame of reference. And two is that perception is dependent on what you do or what you look at. And it's not as good as you think. So, now we're going to talk about how can we change our mind in the light of these two principles, and we're going to actually look at the Baha'i writings. First of all, what is the mind? That's the first thing. We better define it, wouldn't you agree? What is the mind? Now, Abdu'l-Baha says that the mind is not part of the brain. Is not part of the brain. Now, this is very important because those of you that study biology or medicine or neurology or neuroscience and so on, you're learning from a materialistic society in which they think that the mind is located in the brain. It makes no sense if you think about it, because man is so fundamentally different to the animals in so many ways. There's a whole bundle of things that man can do that animals can't do, and yet there are some animals that have brains quite similar to ours in terms of the physical function. In fact, if you want to know the truth, according to DNA, we're very similar even to plants. Did you know that? We all have shared DNA. In fact, I recently read, it says that in terms of shared DNA, a human being is 60% the same as a banana. So I read that. And when I first read it, I thought for sure they're exaggerating, because I know some friends of mine that are not more than 40% bananas. But apparently that's the case. So how could it be that man has all these different things, and yet he has a brain quite similar to other animals, and the animal doesn't have it? There's animals that don't even have 1% of those things, or 10%. There's nothing. So clearly Abdu'l-Baha must be right if you think about it logically. But he says this: the world of the kingdom is sanctified from everything that can be perceived by the eye or by the other senses, hearing, smell, touch, taste. The mind, which is in man, the existence of which is recognized, where is it? In him. If you examine the body with the eye, the ear, or the other senses, you will not find it. Nevertheless, it exists. Therefore, the mind has no place, but it is connected with the brain. So, it's connected with the brain. This is the reason why science thinks the brain is where mind is, because it's connected with the brain. In fact, I like to think of it kind of like this. The brain is a train station. And some trains come in, and then we see the activity in the train station, but the trains came into the brain from somewhere else. We'll talk about this analogy later. He says, now, concerning mental faculties, they are in truth the inherent properties of the soul. So mind is part of your soul, not part of your brain. And he goes on to explain this. He says that the soul, it cannot be obstructed. It's like a light. If you have a light that's there and it's shining, if I were to put a barrel over it or something, am I hurting the light? I'm only hurting the ability for me to see the light, but I can't hurt the light. In the same way, the soul is like that. Consequently, mind cannot be destroyed. But if the brain is not sound physically, then it's like you're obstructing it, but it's not really hurt. We just lose our ability. Consequently, you can't say someone is out of their mind. You can say they're out of their brain. Okay, if you understand what I'm talking about. And there's some people in this room that I'm thinking about as I say that. Okay. Now, Abdu'l-Baha makes an announcement. He says that the best way to think of spirit and mind is to think of light and rays. He says the soul or the spirit is the lamp, and the rays are the mind. Okay, one thing is the essence and the other is the emanation. He says, mind is the power of the human spirit. Spirit is the lamp. Mind is the light which shines from the lamp. And then he makes another analogy. Spirit is the tree and mind is the fruit. So mind is the essential emanation of the spirit. Now you say, is there a difference between soul and spirit? Is there a difference? And here's what Abdu'l-Baha says. He says, the human spirit, which distinguishes man from the animal, is the rational soul. And these two names, the human spirit and the rational soul, designate one thing. So there's just one thing. It's your spirit or your soul. It's like the sun or a lamp. It emanates mind. Mind somehow connects to the brain. And we're going to talk about how it... Do you know how it connects to the brain? We'll talk about that because it has a connection. And so now we know what mind is. And this is the thing we want to change. Now, what is the first principle, the first frame of reference that Baha'u'llah wants us to have? If he wants you to view creation, what is the primary way in which he wants you to view creation? Yeah, I'm talking about a particular frame of reference. Not bad, but yes. Well, that's how we see the physical world. But I'm talking about a spiritual frame of reference. I'll tell you what it is. It is that there are two worlds. There is a physical world and a spiritual world. And you will find this theme so fundamentally embedded in every statement of Baha'u'llah's that there are two worlds. There's a physical world and there's a spiritual world. And he always refers to them both. First example, in one of the hidden words, he says, didst thou behold immortal sovereignty, thou wouldst strive to pass from this fleeting world. So he says there's these two different worlds. And then he says, but to show you one and conceal the other is a mystery which none but the pure in heart can comprehend. And he's basically admitting that there's this great shell game of God that's being played here, in which he's hiding one thing and showing you another. And he's just outrightly admitting that he's faking you out. That's what he's, isn't he? He says, there's one world here and there's another world where I'm going to show you one and I'm going to hide the other. And the reason, it can only be understood if you're pure in heart. So who understands the reason for it? Okay. Now, every time Baha'u'llah refers to creation, he always itemizes the two worlds. Have you noticed that? He never mentions this world, unless he's talking about one in particular, but if he's talking about all creation. Complete these phrases for me. The kingdoms of earth, this world and, or this world and the world to come. All that is heaven and all that is on, the seen and the all things visible, and how many of these could you find? I challenge you to go to the writings and find how creative Baha'u'llah is in having dozens and dozens of different ways, but always itemizing the two worlds. As if to draw your attention, there are two worlds. Baha'u'llah always itemized two worlds, and the Bab always itemized three. Don't ask me why. The Bab always said, this world, the heaven and earth and everything that lieth between them. The Bab was a three-world guy, Baha was a two-world guy. Now, my guess is that when the Bab was active, there was a lot of action between the two worlds, like the concourse on high and the angels and the cohorts who are between, and maybe he had to, they said, can you give us a mention too, or something. I don't know. But Baha'u'llah always refers to two worlds. Now, he is so creative. He talks about the physical world, the contingent world, the world that perisheth, this dust heap, this prison, this fleeting world. You know how many different terms he has for that side? Let's call it that side. Okay, on this side, it's the rose garden of the Spirit. It's everlasting dominion. It's celestial sovereignty. It's immortal sovereignty. It's the placeless. It's the realms of holiness. It's the celestial paradise. It's the garden of eternal delight. We don't, like Christians, we just have heaven. Okay? We have so many words. I actually would love if somebody would go in the writings and give me all the words on this side and all the words on that side. We just have so many. Baha'u'llah is so creative in referring to the two worlds. But we know that there is a frame of reference that only sees one world. And there's some kind of a mystery involved in why he gives us one frame of reference and says, now try and change your frame of reference. This is your test. I'm going to put you into one frame of reference, and it's a trick. It's a trick. Now, he says in the hidden words, close one eye and open the other. Close one eye to the world and open to this one. Is that not basically just saying, stop counting the cars and look at the gorilla? He could have said that, oh, son of whatever. Stop counting the cars and look at the gorilla. He could have said the same thing. Because basically psychology has proven that sometimes you don't see something that's very easy to see. Remember, it's easy to see the gorilla. This is not a hard thing to see. It's just that you're looking at something else. And Baha'u'llah expresses the same principle by saying, close one eye and look at the gorilla. Okay, don't say that. I'm going to say that. Okay, so we have a hidden word, and it's the number one hidden word in the Persian. And it says, O mystic nightingale, the first call of the beloved is this. Now, I'm always interested whenever Baha'u'llah says, this is the first thing you should do, because I'm very mechanistic in my thought process. I want to know what to do first, second, third, fourth. So when Baha'u'llah says, my first call is to do something, I'm interested. So he says, in the first hidden word, and he says, this is my first thing that you need to do. He says, O mystic nightingale, abide not but in the rose garden of the Spirit. Okay, isn't that this one over here? That's the world over here. So basically he's saying, the first thing you got to do is you got to be over here. You got to live in the rose garden of the Spirit. I want you to imagine for a moment that you enroll in a school. And you've never been to the school before, first time, and you go the very first day and you go to a registrar. And the registrar says to you, your homeroom is 47B, you need to go there. That's all you're told. And what is the only thing you're going to ask? Only one question. It is, where is room 47B and how do I get there? There's no other question you need to ask. When you get to that homeroom, then everything will be explained. If I have to be there in 47B, just where is it and how do I get there? Very simple question. Now Baha'u'llah says, O mystic nightingale, go to room 47B. Okay, he says, abide not but in the rose garden of the Spirit. He doesn't just say, go to room 47B. He says, don't go anywhere but 47B. Okay, so let's say you go to this registrar, they say that, and you walk out, and you look around, and you don't immediately see 47B. You look for signs, you don't see any signs. You look over here, you look at there, and then you notice over there that there's another room, And it's 27B, but it's a big building. And you hear a lot of noise, a lot of excitement, a lot of laughter, and it looks really fun, room 27B. And when you look, you hear music and the people are dancing and having a party, and you can smell food coming from it, and you say, well, maybe I should go to 27B and check that one out. But you say, no, he said I have to go to 47B. So you go back to the registrar and you say, I looked around and I couldn't see 47B. Are you sure that's where I have to go? And he says, yes. He says, but how come there's no sign to 47B, but there's plenty of signs showing me how to get to 27B? And the registrar says, well, that's the mystery that only the pure in heart can comprehend. And you say, well, thanks a lot. And he says, but you can see it. You can see it. You only need two qualities. You only need two qualities to see it. And Baha'u'llah constantly refers to these two qualities. And those two qualities are eagerness and enthusiasm in your search. And we'll come to that. So he says you need two qualities. So you go out. Now, you go out and probably, if you're like most people, you say, well, let's just, check out 27B. So you go check out 27B, and it's kind of a lot of fun, and you enjoy it. And perhaps you just stay there, and time passes, and the whole 4 years goes by, and it comes time for your exam, and you don't know anything on the exam, because you spent the whole time in room 27B. Now, this is just an analogy. But basically, Baha'u'llah says, you need to go here, and you don't need to go there. And we need to say, okay, Baha'u'llah, if I need to go there and I don't need to go here, can you just tell me where is it and how can I get there? That's really what we need to do. How much time do I have? 10 more minutes. Okay. So basically then, I want to see if we can understand what is the difference between room 47B and 27B. I made those up. Those room numbers. It's not in the Baha'i writings anywhere to my knowledge. But I want to say, what is the difference between the two worlds? Which side is my good world and my bad world? Is this my bad world? This is the bad world. Okay. So let's first of all talk about what are the characteristics, what are the qualities of this world that we can see. Okay. And I go through the writings and I collect them, and then anything that mentions the contingent world, the world of being, the physical world, and so on, I see what qualities he ascribes to that, and we make a list. I'm going to just list them first, and then we'll go into more detail. He says that the physical world is not reality. It's not reality. Now this is hard to accept because there's two worlds. There's the real world and the not real world. And the one we think is real is the not real, and the one we're not sure is real is the real one. It's not reality. It's phony, it's made up, it's a construct. It's like a little play that somebody wrote or a little acting out. We don't realize that it's not reality until we die. But Muhammad once said, this world is but a dream, we awaken upon death. And how many of you are familiar with that strange experience when you first wake up from a dream? When you were in the dream, you thought it was reality. And then you have that sudden moment, oh, it was but a dream. Okay, and this is what death is. Death is the realization that life was but a dream. Okay, so the first principle is that it's not reality. The second principle is that it is illusory. It's an illusion. We'll talk about this later. The third property is that it is fleeting. If you do a search on fleeting in this world, I think you'll find maybe hundreds. The world, it passes quickly. Another principle of this physical world is that it's valueless and insignificant. Each one of these categories, basically, I took a quote and I said, well, that goes in that category, that category, until I had maybe 20, 30 quotes for each of these. So, it's not reality, it's illusory, it's fleeting, it's valueless and insignificant. The next one is it's vain. He uses the word vain all the time, or vanity, the world and all its vanities. And of course, as you know, vain means that it has an exaggerated sense of its own importance. It thinks it's more important than it is. The world has vanity. The next principle is that it is a symbolic representation of the spiritual world. Now, last year we had a whole 2 subjects on this, and I'm going to draw on some of that information in this talk, but I'm not going to give the 2 talks I gave last year. However, there will be some things I'm going to say in this talk that won't make sense if you did. How many were here last year? Okay, so the majority. Those of you that were not here last year, you won't understand a lot of what I say in this talk. But Don said that he said that he can make available the 2 talks that were given last year. And so some of the things I say now won't make any sense, but then if you listen to those talks, it'll make sense later. But basically, this is a very important principle, that the physical world, while it's not reality, it's illusory, it's fleeting, it's valueless, insignificant, it's vain, it also is a representation of this world. It has a symbolic relationship. And the last thing that I find about the physical world is that time spent here is latent with opportunity. Even though it's valueless, insignificant, the time that we spend here has certain opportunities, potentialities that will not come again. And we can talk about that. We'll read that. So now let's look at a few quotations from the writings that support each of these categories. First of all, let's take the idea that the physical world is not reality. Abdu'l-Baha says, life is of 2 kinds. That of the body and that of the spirit. The life of the body is material life. The life of the spirit expresses the existence of the kingdom. And whenever he says the kingdom with a capital K, he's not talking about Disneyland. He's talking about the spiritual world. That's another term, the Apa kingdom. I mean, there's so many terms. So he says there's 2 kinds of life, the physical and the kingdom in this case. Okay, he says, although the material life has existence, it is pure non-existence and absolute death for holy saints. So, man exists and this stone exists. But what a difference between the existence of man and that stone. Though the stone exists, in relation to man, it is non-existent. So, the physical world kind of exists, but in relation to that world, it might as well be a stone to man. Okay. Some totally inanimate thing. He often refers to stones in the physical world as things that have no life. He talks about bringing stones to life and so on. Everything in the physical world, Abdu'l-Baha has a role for it to play in the spiritual world, and even stones have it. It's very interesting. Now, would you agree then, from what Abdu'l-Baha said, that this world is not real? Okay, let's take illusory, or it's an illusion. This is Baha'u'llah in Gleanings. He says, the world is but a show, vain and empty, a mere nothing, bearing the semblance of reality. Now, the interesting thing there is he got all 6 of the qualities in one sentence. It's but a show, vain, empty, bearing the semblance, which is symbolism. He got it all in one line. He says, verily I say, the world is like a vapor in a desert, which the thirsty dreameth to be water, and striveth after it with all his might, until he cometh unto it, and findeth it to be mere illusion. This physical world is mere illusion. Okay, let's take the next quality of this world. It's valueless and insignificant. I put those in the 2 things. And for example, we can see this in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, in which Baha'u'llah says, in the estimation of the people of Baha, the whole world is worth as much as the black eye of a dead ant. Now, when I first read this, if it was not Baha'u'llah, I would accuse the writer of hyperbole, in other words, of exaggerating. Surely you don't have to go that far. An ant is pretty small and insignificant, okay? So that would be enough. But no, he has to take the eye of the ant, just the eye. But then he has to kill the ant. He says, the black eye of a dead ant. As if to say, is that insignificant enough for you? Isn't that amazing? Now, we can't accuse Baha'u'llah of exaggeration, can we? in relation to the physical world, he says, the whole world, in the estimation of the people of Baha, is worth as much as the black eye of a dead ant. Now, if I go outside and find a dead ant, take the black eye and give it to you, how much value would you place in that? Okay, would you say it's worth as much as your house and your car and all your clothing and everything? According to Baha'u'llah, yeah. So we can go out and collect some dead ants later and say we've got all the wealth of the world in that. Valueless and insignificant, according to Baha'u'llah. The next principle is that the physical world is a symbolic representation of the spiritual world. I talked about this last year, so I don't want to mention it now. But basically, it's that everything in the physical world has a spiritual counterpart. Everything. He says every atom in existence reflecteth some part of the spiritual world. So just as there are rivers, there are spiritual rivers. Just as there are physical mountains, there are spiritual mountains. Just as and so on. Just take all of physical creation, and you will find that the manifestation of God constantly uses analogies from the physical world to explain a spiritual principle. Even the relationships that occur between physical things, they have a spiritual counterpart. So the physical world, while it has no value, it's an illusion, it's I didn't even do fleeting. You want to do fleeting as well? Okay. Fleeting is a very interesting one because it's probably the largest category. When I started categorizing all the features of this world over here, fleeting came up more. Fleeting or some other. Swiftly fading, fastly disappearing, evanescent. There's many words that I put in the fleeting category. And why does he constantly tell you this? Furthermore, he says that if you can get a frame of reference that the world is fleeting, you will very quickly change. He says, wert thou to consider this world and realize how fleeting are the things that pertain unto it, thou wouldst choose to tread no path except the path of service to the cause of God. Now, this is interesting because he's saying if you have a different frame of reference in relation to this world, you will do something different. He doesn't say, go and serve the cause. He says, rather, try and change your frame of reference to realize how fleeting it is. I remember Hand of the Cause, John Robarts. He always used to say in his talks, he would say, this world is like a bird flying through a banquet hall in which it goes in one window, it has enough time to grab a little bit of food on the table, and it goes out the other window. And that's basically what he has. Now, since we're talking about fleeting, I realize that it's now time to finish, because this time has fled. And we'll have 2 more sessions in which we're going to further describe this world, then we're going to describe that world, and then we're going to see how we can change our own frame of reference. So we'll see you here, same place, after lunch. Thank you very much. It's been a great school. Hasn't it been a wonderful school? How many of you are here in this session now and were not in the session 1? Okay, so just a few. Okay, so I'll just recap very briefly then. The subject of this course, which is going to continue now and then on into the afternoon, is called Creating a New Mind. And we're looking at the Baha'i writings to see what are the principles involved in creating a new mind. And first we looked at 2 psychological principles, one from science and one from psychology. And who can tell me what those 2 principles are? The one from physics is what? It's the concept that you cannot change your opinion of something or your idea of something without changing your frame of reference. The second is that we looked at a particular concept in psychology in which they believe that the human being doesn't have as good perception as we think. And what was that called? Inattentional blindness. And you can look both these things up. They're quite easily referenced on the internet or in textbooks and so on. Then we looked at the fact that Baha'u'llah says there are 2 worlds, and we started talking about one of the 2 worlds. Which one? The physical world. And we described some of the qualities of the physical world, and we know that Baha'u'llah says we should only abide in one of those 2 worlds. Which one? The spiritual world. But for some reason, Baha'u'llah says, he shows us the physical world and hides the other one from us. And he hides the one that he wants us to live in and shows us the one he doesn't want us to live in. And he says, the reason for this is a mystery which only the pure in heart can comprehend, and therefore I cannot comprehend it. So I said, well, let's try to figure out what is the physical world, and let's try to figure out what is the spiritual world. What's the MO, so to speak, of each world. And we already found out some of the qualities of the physical world. I can't remember how far we got, but we found that it's not reality. We found it was illusory, or it was an illusion. We found it was valueless and insignificant. In fact, it was not even as valuable as the black eye of a dead ant, okay, or a dead uncle. I understand the same. And did we get to vain or fleeting? I think we got to fleeting and then we stopped. Okay, so let's move right along to fleeting. Now, the interesting thing about fleeting is that he says that fleeting is something you should meditate on. There's some things that Baha'u'llah tells you to meditate on. Have you noticed that? He says something, he says, meditate on this. And we should really take him at his word, because some things, when you meditate on them, lots of things are revealed. There are many passages in which Baha'u'llah or Ad-Baha says, this is a brief answer, but if you meditate, the rest will be given to you. And this is because he knows the human faculty has the ability to reflect truth. And if he gives you enough of it, you can find the rest. Well, one of those things is the fleetingness of this world. He says, meditate on it. He says, wert thou to consider this world and realize how fleeting are the things that pertain unto it, thou wouldst choose to tread no path except the path of service to the cause of thy Lord. Now, you know as well as I do that if you're not going to stay somewhere for very long, you don't have as much regard for it. Isn't that right? Like, for example, if you have to buy a house and live in it for the rest of your life, you're going to want to have it comfortable. But if you want to stay somewhere for just a night, you can say, it's just a night, I can sleep there. Is that right? So basically, your knowledge of how long something is going to last can determine how you treat it. For example, if someone is standing up here giving a talk, for one person you might say, well, if he's going to speak for 5 minutes, I'll sit here. But any longer than that, I'm not. You see? It determines how you view something. And Baha'u'llah says you need to think about how fleeting the world is so you don't regard it with any great value. He says, your lives on this earthly plane, which pass away as a fleeting moment. They pass away as a fleeting moment. He says, whosoever hath tasted the sweetness of these worlds will never consent to transgress the bounds which God has fixed. He will turn his gaze towards no one except the well-beloved. Such a man will, with his inner eye, readily recognize how altogether vain and fleeting are the things of this world, and will set his affections on things above. How vain and fleeting. In some prayers, we pray to God to give us the frame of reference that the world is fleeting. We actually pray for a frame of reference. It doesn't say that way. It doesn't say, oh God, give me a frame of reference that the world is fleeting. But it says basically that. For example, he says, give me to drink of the wine of thy mercy and of the pure beverage of thy favor, which have streamed forth from the right hand of thy will, that I may so fix my gaze upon thee and be so detached from all else but thee, that the world and all that hath been created therein may appear before me as a fleeting day, which thou hast not deigned to create. So you pray to God to give you the vision that the world is just a fleeting day. There's another prayer here I could read in which he says, O God, give me a disposition that will enable me to consider the world as a shadow that vanisheth swifter than the twinkling of an eye. We're actually praying for God to give us a new frame of reference. And that frame of reference is that we're just here for a very brief period of time. So, fleeting is fairly... Okay, well, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I had fun with fleeting. Okay. The next thing, I not even mentioned this, but the next quality of the physical world is that it is constrained by certain limitations that are artificial. The physical world is constrained by certain limitations that are artificial. And some of these limitations are time and physical space. or physical matter and physical space, time and space. Now, this is a very important thing to understand, that time is part of the physical world and is not part of the spiritual world. In fact, the spiritual world is more often referred to in terms of eternalness than it is in terms of placeless. Like he says the placeless, but he more often says the eternal realm, the immortal realm, eternity, and so on. Timeless and so on. In other words, it's quite easy for most of us to somewhat imagine a world without physical matter. We can kind of vaguely... I can imagine that there's a world in which I'm just a ghost like Casper flying around. It's kind of, I can roughly get a feel of that. It's much more difficult for me to get the concept of there being no time. That's a greater limitation than the other. And the concept of eternity, Abdu'l-Baha says, is one of the great concepts to meditate. He says if you want to acquire spirituality, meditate on the future life. If you meditate on eternity, you gain a completely new frame of reference. And eternity is a very large subject. Now, I don't know how to pronounce the word in Arabic very well. But is it baqa or baq? How do you say it? Baqa? Okay, baqa. And this is a very important concept, and it's all over the Baha'i writings, translated variously by different words. And it means eternity. In Sufi mysticism and in Islamic tradition generally, there are two fundamental states that are the highest. They are fana and baqa. Do we have Mr. Fana here? Is he here? Yes. He's named after fana. But fana and baqa are the two great states in Sufi mysticism. Fana is the last valley in the seven valleys. It's one word, but in seven valleys they translate it as, absolute nothingness and true poverty. It takes a lot of English words to contain that. And after you reach fana, which means complete annihilation of the self, you go to eternity. And eternity is such an important concept because if we meditate on God's eternity, we come to some realization about the reality of the other world. Now, there's one prayer that uses this word eternity 60 times in one prayer, the long healing prayer. And it has the baqa 60 times. I think we counted it more than 60 times in it. In English, it's translated as abiding. But it's abiding in the sense of the eternal nature of God. Shoghi Effendi translated that word in various forms. So we have this thing about eternity, and the important thing to understand about eternity is that some people think eternity is endless time. It's just time going on and on and on. We think eternity is endless time. For example, we think, how long is this speech going to last? It's going to last an eternity. Now, eternity is not endless time. Eternity is no time. It's not endless time, it's no time. There's a big difference. And in the seven valleys, Baha'u'llah explains that there are three kinds of eternity. He says there's four kinds of time. Does anyone remember the word Zaman? Who knows the four? Anyone know them? It doesn't matter. There's four kinds of time. Three of them refer to aspects of eternity, and one refers to this kind of time that has a beginning and end in this world. And he says the one kind of eternity has no beginning, but it has some end. So it goes that way and has an end. Another has a beginning, but it has no end. And the third has no beginning and no end. And it's very important to meditate on all three of these. And so just think of a hose that has a stop here and goes forever that way, or when it goes that way, and so on. And I was very glad to read this in the Seven Valleys one time, because I used to think that Baha'u'llah was redundant in the first hidden word. Because he said, if you have a pure, kindly, and radiant heart, you'll have a sovereignty ancient, imperishable, and everlasting. And I thought, well, why do you have to say all three? Can't you just, you said that the hidden words were going to be in the garment of brevity. Why did you say three things that mean the same thing? And then when I read that Baha'u'llah said that eternity is classified into three areas, I thought very carefully, well, ancient gives an indication of backwardness forever, but doesn't guarantee that it couldn't die sometime. Imperishable, it goes that way, but it doesn't give any guarantee it could have been created yesterday. And everlasting goes both ways. So Baha'u'llah was very careful to say that you have all forms of eternity. And he defined them. And I will bet you, although I haven't, maybe a Persian or an Arab, someone speaks Arabic, I'll bet you they're the same words in the seven valleys as in the first hidden word. I'll bet you they're the same. So the concept of eternity is very, very important. Don't think of eternity as a line going that way forever. Just think of it as an instant beam going up, like Scotty would beam you up, or something like that. Eternity is no time. So the physical world is limited by time. Fortunately, I say fortunately, I'm not sure, modern physics, at least since, 1905 or thereabouts, has figured out that time is pretty phony anyway. We thought time was some kind of constant in the universe. In fact, there was time, and then there was space, and space had 3 dimensions, and time was 1 dimension. And Einstein comes along, and he meditates, and he gets a new frame of reference, and he somehow realizes that time is totally phony. It can slow down, it can speed up. It doesn't really slow down or speed up according to your experience of it, but relative to someone else. So if I'm standing on the sun, if I could stand on the sun, like I could go at night, like the old joke is, time moves much slower for me. Time moves slower for me on the sun because gravity slows down time. In fact, even time on Earth, right here where we are, moves 7 milliseconds slower than the satellite that's just in space that your cell phone uses, just because it's a little closer to Earth. Gravity slows time down. The more gravity you have, the slower time has. And if you have a lot of gravity, like a black hole, you have virtually eternity. And if you bring all the universe into one dot, which they call the singularity, which means that one time before the Big Bang, everything, they say it had to have been eternity. And so if you imagine that God is all creation and he has all gravity, then you could say, veiled in my immemorial being and the ancient eternity of my essence. If God is all things, he would bring all time into it. Also, many people like to compare gravity to love. How many of you have heard of that? That gravity is kind of like love? Well, Einstein found that the stronger the gravitational field, the slower time comes down. And Abdu'l-Baha said, where there's love, there is always time. Now, I don't know. It's just a very interesting concept, you see. So, we have to free ourselves from the concept of time. It is the greatest of all the limitations of the physical world. It's a much greater barrier to our thinking. Now, there are many things about eternity that I can't talk about. We would have to give a whole talk just on eternity. Why are you laughing now? What's so funny?
How long did that talk last?
Well, oh, yes. It would take me a long time to talk about eternity. That's very good. I like that. So let's move on to another principle of the physical world, and that is that the physical world is a symbolic representation of this world. Okay, now we dealt with this subject last year, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but basically Abdu'l-Baha said, if you want to understand the spiritual world, look to the physical world. Look to the physical world and you'll understand it. And any time the manifestation of God uses a physical symbol to represent a spiritual truth, you should think hard and long about that physical symbol, because a lot of spiritual truth will be given to you. Now, all religions in the past have relied on this principle, that the physical world represents the spiritual world. And Abdu'l-Baha said there would be no way in which the manifestations could teach anything if they didn't have the physical world as an example. And this is why God created the physical world as a mirror, because the physical world is like the language of the spiritual world. That's why it's called the kingdom of names. A name doesn't have reality. It represents something. And this world doesn't have reality, but it represents something, just like a word represents a concept or an idea. Religions in the past are traditionally divided into various classifications. So they call them pantheism, polytheism, monotheism, and there's one other great one, idolatry. Okay, these are the various, anthropologists they look and they say, and religions, some they're idol worships, and some they're pantheistic, and some they're polytheistic, and some are monotheistic from Abraham on. It's my belief that probably all religions were true and divine, and they weren't polytheistic or pantheistic or whatever. It's just that the symbols were used, and now in history we lost it. So a long time ago, to teach the concept of the manifestation of God, they may had to use the sun, or they may had to use the stars or heaven or water and rivers, things that gave life that they could understand in the physical world. With the passage of time and the loss of language, we look at these religions and we say they were sun worshippers, or they worshipped, the heavens or the stars. They worshipped rivers and called them sacred. But I don't believe that. I believe that these were symbols that they used, and they perfectly well understood that they were talking about God, but that was a way to explain it. Likewise, God has many attributes, and Abdu'l-Baha says there is no way to know the reality or essence of God. You can only know his names or attributes. Consequently, God is often described in different ways. This characteristic, that characteristic, this characteristic. And so in some cultures, those become personified. So as in the Indian cultures or the Greek cultures. And then we think they're polytheistic, but they weren't polytheistic. You could look at the long healing prayer and say that's polytheistic because it's calling on 140 different gods. But we understand it's one God with 140 attributes. Likewise, pantheism, which is the belief that God actually is in physical matter, like he's in the trees and he's in the thing. Abdu'l-Baha says there basically is a foundational truth to pantheism, that in one sense, pantheism is correct. So my belief is that all religions were true and divine, and only because we don't have a good knowledge or record of this, we don't realize that they had a good understanding that this physical world symbolically represented the spiritual world, and that's the only way the manifestation of God can do it. Now, last year, I proposed the idea that we know more about the physical world today than we've ever known before. Consequently, we have more ability to understand spiritual truth, because in the past they only knew sun and river and ocean. There was only so much language the manifestation of God could use to educate us about spiritual things. And lo and behold, Abdu'l-Baha writes a letter to the Baha'is in America about Rezvan, and he says, in this century, more scientific achievements and discoveries have been made than in the past 100 centuries. Now, I read that last year, but it didn't hit me what Abdu'l-Baha was saying. Because what is 100 centuries? Is it not 10,000 years? Okay, 10,000 years is more than what we call recorded history. Okay, recorded history, 6,000, 7,000 years is not very much. And Abdu'l-Baha is saying that there has been more scientific discoveries this century than take the invention of the wheel, the discovery of fire, and take everything that the Greeks discovered and everything that Newton and Galileo and all the Arabian, Islamic, add it all together, and it still doesn't equal what we've learned in this one century? I didn't believe it. I didn't believe it myself. So I went to several textbooks that listed every scientific discovery, like the 1,000 greatest discoveries or the 100 greatest discoveries of physics or biology, and I just looked at the dates of all of them and then calculated it, and I found, to my startling belief, even when you throw in Newton and Galileo and Plato and Aristotle and who you name it, the majority of everything we know about everything, well, any branch of science, the majority has been discovered during the time since the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared. Isn't that amazing? The majority of everything we know. You can test this yourself. Go to the internet and do some research. It'll take you a long time, but you'll come to the conclusion that Abdu'l-Baha was right, which we probably should have just accepted to begin with. But so this means that the physical world, although it is valueless, it's insignificant, it's fleeting, it's illusory, it still has the power to communicate something to us if we use it as a language of the spiritual world. The final principle of the physical world, and we're going to get onto the spiritual world soon, is that Abdu'l-Baha said the time here on this life is latent with opportunity. The time we spend here has a lot of opportunity. For example, he says, the fleeting hours of man's life on earth pass swiftly by, and the little that still remaineth shall come to an end. But that which endureth and lasteth for evermore is the fruit that man reapeth from his servitude at the divine threshold. Behold the truth of this saying, how abundant and glorious are the proofs therein in the world of being. And in answer to one question, he once said that the value of this life is very much like a man going on a journey through many countries. He says when you go on a journey through many countries, you gain different perspectives and understandings of cultures and different things. He basically could have said frame of reference as well there. So there is something about this world that has opportunity. The Sufi mystics, who always taught by parable, which is another way of using the physical world, they understood the physical world the opportunity of the physical world in a famous story about a camel rider in the desert. And this was that a man who wanted to ride a camel through a long journey in the desert, and he gets on the camel and he starts to ride through the desert. And after many days' journey, a voice cries out and says, "Stop and gather up the stones in the dried up riverbed." And he looks down and there's a little riverbed there, dried up, and this voice says, "Stop and gather the stones in the dried up riverbed." So he gets off the camel, he picks up a handful of stones and puts them in his saddlebag, and he gets on the camel, and the voice cries out again and says, "Good. Because you have obeyed, tomorrow you will be both happy and sad." And he says, "I'll be happy and sad? I don't quite understand that." So he rides off, rides into the sunset, goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, and he remembers the strange events of the previous day. He goes back to his saddlebag, reaches inside, and all those stones were now gems. They were precious jewels. And at that very moment, he was happy that he had gathered all those stones, but sad that he hadn't taken more. Because the river was full of stones. It was completely full of stones. And he could have taken as much as he wanted to. And this is what the Hand of the Cause, John Robarts, always said. This life is like a bird flying through a banquet hall. The table is full. It just can fly in. It can grab something on the table and go out, and it has to fly out the other side. And then you realize, oh my God, there was some really good food on that table that you could no longer take. So this is the last concept of the physical world. Now, the thing about it is, the physical world, it very much draws our attention. The physical world is counting the cars, and the spiritual world is the gorilla. Now, if you weren't in the talk earlier today and you just heard that I said the physical world is counting cars and the spiritual world is the gorilla, I'm sorry, I'm not going to explain it to you, but everyone else understands what we're talking about. You may not realize this, that the horse, you know, the animal, the horse, is one of a certain group of animals that has rear vision. Did you know that a horse has rear vision? And the reason is because of the location of its eyes and the shape of its head. And it can flip and it can look pretty much back, or it can just go like that, it can see. Because of this characteristic of the horse is naturally very good at racing. In the wild, horses, you know, they race. Because they can see the horse coming from behind and they can decide when to make their move. They're naturally well built for racing because they have total rear vision. It's like they have a rear vision, a side vision, and forward vision, all with just two spots. Because of this, when man started to race horses, when he first started to race horses, I don't know how many hundred or thousands of years ago, he found that the horse was making too many decisions about racing. The horse knew too much, and the jockey wanted to have total control of the horse, and I want to decide when you move and when you don't move. So they built blinders to put on horses, and they go like this, and they basically cut off 3/4 of the horse's vision, just so the jockey can completely have control of the horse. And it seems like such torture. And go look at one of these blinders, and you'll realize what a torture it is, cutting off 3/4 of their vision. But if you think about it, we all have blinders on ourselves too. And it's this physical world that puts the blinders on us. And consequently, we are being ridden like a jockey towards a certain finish line that the physical world defines for us, and never realizing that the physical world puts blinders on us in the same way that we put blinders on a horse. And what are some of the blinders of the physical world? Well, I could probably name dozens and dozens of them. One of them is material wealth. Wouldn't you believe that that's a blinder? Another one is the desire for physical comfort. That's a blinder. Another is the desire for material possessions. These are blinders that cause us not to see things. Another is the worship of the physical body or the desire for physical beauty. And that even more decadent concept, the worship of youth in our culture, in which for some reason we value a young body over an old body. Or even worse, we think we're worthless as we get older, as if the physical body matters. And Baha'u'llah talks about many other things that you would classify as blinders. One is he calls idle fancies and vain imaginations. In other words, any idea that you just pick up by osmosis in the world, that you never really gave it some thought, and it's not true. These are all blinders. Now, we could probably do a whole talk on blinders. The whole idea of the advancement over others or being better than others. These are all blinders. We are taught from the day we're born until the day we're dead by this physical world that these are important things. And if you want to get to the finish line of the physical life like a horse, you've got to not see all these things. We need to take the blinders off. We need to take them off, because this is not the horse race of life that we're meant to run. It is the phony one. Now, it's so phony that it makes me think that God is playing hanky-panky. Now, the reason I use the word hanky-panky, and you're laughing right now, is because some of you may not realize the meaning of that word, or the origin of that phrase. In fact, the word hanky-panky was common in England in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries among magicians. And it was a magician term because magicians found that if you wanted to do a trick, any trick at all, with one hand, all you had to do is at the certain moment with one hand, the other hand, you would pull a handkerchief out. And you'd fluff it out, and it would be a brightly colored handkerchief. And you'd pull that out, and then at that moment you would do the thing that you needed to pull a coin out of the pocket, or, do whatever it is. And any magician knew that if a handkerchief came out, look anywhere but the handkerchief. They understood that. But the normal person didn't understand. And this worked so well that magicians did it over and over again. Anytime they wanted to do any trick, out came the handkerchief. And after a while they said it's the old hanky-panky. And that's where the phrase comes. Now, hanky-panky is nothing but an expression of inattentional blindness. Isn't that right? If you look at one thing, you miss the other. But it worked so well that it became a catchphrase. It became a phrase. And when Baha'u'llah says, blind thine eye, or close one eye and look at the other, he also understands inattentional blindness. So is God not playing hanky-panky when he says, I've created one world, I'm showing you one, hiding the other? Is he not, in the true meaning of the word? Now, don't go home and say, Tom says God plays hanky-panky. Okay? Unless you explain the origin of the meaning of the word. But you can see that inattentional blindness definitely applies to the spiritual world. You don't see the gorilla because the physical world is making you count the cars. Does that make sense? It's a very simple concept. So, do you think we have a good idea what this world is like? Fleeting, inconsequential, restricted by time, and so on. How about the qualities of this other world? This is the world we really want to know. So I wrote down some, I went to the writings and I looked at quotations, and this is not every one, but I was classifying them in various categories, and these are some of the ones that I want to mention today. One of the qualities of the real world is that it is multi-sensual. Multi-sensual, it means it has a number of different senses. And we'll come to that in a moment. The second principle is that it is very close to us and very quickly reached. Close and quickly reached. The third, it is not bound by time and space, which is actually just the opposite of the other one. The fourth is that in order to live in it, you have to acquire what Abdu'l-Baha calls the fourth kind of spirit, or the fourth kind of life form. There are 5 kinds of spirit or life, and in order to go into that world, you have to have a different kind of life than the one you have in this world, and we'll talk about that. And the fifth is that in order to dwell in the rose garden of the spirit, which is where room 40, what room was it number now? If you want to dwell in 47B, it requires a certain measure of withdrawal from the physical world. A certain amount of physical sensory deprivation. When I say a certain amount, not total, but it does require a certain amount, and that amount we're going to try and define. So let's look at these 5 qualities. Now, some of them may surprise you. You may not even know what I meant when I said them. Let's take, first of all, multi-sensual. The fact that the spiritual world is multi-sensual. Abdu'l-Baha says that in the physical world we have 5 senses. And in the spiritual world, we also have 5 senses. Now, maybe, or he calls them 5 powers or 5 senses. And he describes what the physical senses are and what the spiritual senses are. Now, if you think of the physical senses, the most important thing is that each one does something that the other one cannot do. They don't intersect in capability. Would you agree? Okay, so the eyes can see, the ears can hear, but the ears can't see, and the eyes can't hear, and so on. The nose smells, and the eye doesn't smell. The feet smell, but the eyes don't, and so on. You understand? All of the physical senses don't intersect. Now, there's a very important principle here, because if you use a particular physical sense for something that it's not appropriate, you just don't know anything about that. So, for example, if I were to take a rose and hold it to my ear, I don't get much, right? If I said, "You're like a rose to my ears," okay, it doesn't. But if I said, "You're like music to my nose," that also doesn't make any sense. We understand that there's certain parts of the world that we're just not going to know even exist without that sense or that sense or that sense. If we don't use all of our senses, the loss of any one physical sense will take away a whole chunk of this physical world. Would you agree? You must use them all. So now Abdu'l-Baha says you've got 5 spiritual powers as well. And likewise, if we don't use each of those 5 spiritual powers, we're going to miss on a whole big chunk of that world, because they don't intersect. Let's say I have a chocolate sundae in front of me right now, and I look at it. Let's say it's the best. Have you ever had a really good one? And you look at that chocolate sundae. Now, how long could I look at it, and would I understand it as well as if I tasted it? Can the eyes really ever know? Okay, what if I held it up to my ear? It's not going to help at all. Because it's only if you taste the chocolate sundae do you even remotely know. Now, Baha'u'llah says, "Cause me to taste, O my Lord, the divine sweetness of thy remembrance and praise." If you don't use that spiritual sense, you're going to miss out on God. If you don't use that sense, you're going to miss out on God in whatever he's talking about. Now, if you go through the Baha'i writings and you look at the way in which he refers to understanding God or knowledge, he employs all 5 of the physical senses. Sometimes he says, "Cause me to taste of the divine sweetness, cause me to inhale the fragrance, cause me to see." Do you understand? To touch. And every time he's using these, you know that they're spiritual vision. You know that they're spiritual hearing, they're not physical. And yet he uses all. In fact, I went through and collected these, and I found that Baha'u'llah is a completely equal opportunity employer of all 5 senses in the spiritual world. He uses them all. Now, this is very interesting because in past religions, to symbolize lack of spiritual perception, they always used an illness that had the lack of a physical sense. So in the Bible, the 3 things that are most commonly used to represent lack of spiritual knowledge are blindness, which is the lack of the sense of sight, or the lack of the sense of hearing, and so deafness rather, lack of the sense of, or leprosy, which is the basic symptom of which is the lack of the sense of touch. It's the lack of one of the senses. That's the primary symptom. And we know that when Christ is talking about the leper, he's not talking about the physical leper. He's talking about someone that has one sense missing in the spiritual world. In this case, the sense of touch. He's talking about blindness. He's not talking about physical blindness, but he's talking about the loss of the spiritual power of vision and so on. So the soul has 5 different powers. And Abdu'l-Baha describes what they are, and I want you to make a note of what they are, because I'm going to describe them to you now. They're in some answer questions, but we'll go through them. The first spiritual power, he says, is the power of imagination. He refers to this as the first one. That man has the ability to somehow, just in his own mind, see something without his eyes seeing. He can envisage things, he can imagine something. This is so fundamentally inherent in the human being and so lacking in animals that it is considered one of the primary characteristics that distinguish human beings. And we're going to talk about that a little later. But Abdu'l-Baha says it's a spiritual power. It's one of the spiritual senses, imagination. The second one, he says, is reflection. And it's a different power. He sometimes refers to it as thought, but he says it's the power of reflection, that you can actually reflect on something. And once again, this is one of the different characteristics of the soul, and it's different to imagination, in the same way that sight is different to hearing. The third power, he says, is comprehension. He uses some other terms, but comprehension, in which you understand something. It comes third in Abdu'l-Baha's list. The fourth, he calls memory, and some other terms. And I like to think of memory as like hitting the save button on the computer. You know, you hit the save and then you got it stored, you know where it is, and so on. And the fifth sense is an interesting one. He refers to it as the common faculty. And he says this is a spiritual power that has the ability to communicate with the physical. It's like the messenger boy of the spirit. Because the physical and the spiritual have to communicate. But the physical can't go that way, but the spiritual can come this way. And that is a special faculty, a special power which the soul has, which he calls the common faculty. There's a letter that Abdu'l-Baha wrote to I can't remember the doctor now, but he referred to the same thing as the sympathetic nerve. But if you read the wording of how he describes sympathetic nerve, it's quite clear that the sympathetic nerve and the common faculty are one and the same. It's a spiritual power that has the ability to communicate with the physical body. Now, we need to use all of these spiritual powers, and we don't use them. And that's why we don't see a lot of the gorilla of the spiritual world. We don't because we're like blind or deaf, and we're not using them. We're even taught in our schools and education to pretty much bypass the first two spiritual powers. Because if you think about it, you first should use imagination, then use reflection, and then go to comprehension. But many times we want to comprehend immediately. We want to bypass the first two, and we want to skip it and go straight to comprehension. We'll read a quotation and we'll say, what does this mean? Or we'll read anything in the newspaper. We want to know what it means now. I want it now. So we want to go straight to comprehension. And yet many times in the writings, Baha'u'llah says, meditate, ponder on this. He says, use your first two spiritual senses. Teachers in school will often insist that a student have immediate comprehension. They'll say something and they say, okay, what does this mean? The student that raises the hand the quickest, he's taught that skip the first two spiritual senses and go straight to comprehension. Then what makes it even worse is our education process says, let's even skip comprehension and go straight to memory. Let's not imagine and do it. Let's not reflect upon it. Let's not even understand it. Just commit it to memory. And students are often taught to do this, and we often do this too. And so then it's like we have no eyes and no ears and no mouth. And it's like if I came up to you right now and said, I want you to open your mouth and eat this, but close your eyes and close your ears and don't smell it. Just eat it. And that's basically what you're doing when you don't use these senses. So the spiritual world is multi-sensual, and we need to know how to use each of these spiritual senses. Now, some of them, Abdu'l-Baha has told you how we can use them. For example, he's told us certain rules about how you can use the power of reflection. For example, he says that reflection cannot work unless there's absolute silence. He says this it's in Paris Talks, a talk on meditation. I may read from it later on. He says that silence is absolutely necessary for that particular spiritual sense. Now this is pretty bad, because some of us have no silence in our lives. We wake up in the morning and there might be noise going on, people in the house or something. We'll go to work, we'll go to school, we'll drive, we'll come back, we'll come home, and we may not have even a moment's silence. And now Abdu'l-Baha says this particular sense doesn't work except in silence. Just this particular one. So we may have to modify our whole lifestyle to understand how to use some of these senses. Anyway, that's one quality of the spiritual world, that it has many different senses. The second is that it is close and it's quickly reached. Now this is something kind of interesting, because didn't we just say that it's hard to see, it's the gorilla that you can't see, you're looking at this. Didn't Baha'u'llah say he's hidden it from you and shown you the other? But then he also says, although I've hidden it from you, it's really close. It's very, very close. And also, it's not far away in terms of reaching. You can reach it very quickly. Let me read you some of these quotations. He says in the Hidden Words, "Thou art but one step away from the glorious heights above, and from the celestial tree of love. Take thou one pace, and with the next advance into the immortal realm, and enter the pavilion of eternity." Now, he says, just take one pace and with the next. And what are you going to enter? Is he referring to the next world as placeless or timeless? I'll read it to you. Advance into the immortal realm and enter the pavilion of eternity. Timeless. Okay? More often he refers to it as timeless. But you're only one step away. He says in the Gleanings, he says, "This most great, this fathomless and surging ocean is near, astonishingly near unto you. Behold, it is closer to you than your life vein. Swift as the twinkling of an eye, you can, if you but wish it, reach and partake of this imperishable favor, this God-given grace, this incorruptible gift, this most potent and unspeakably glorious bounty." And there's many, many quotes. He talks about the divine elixir that can, in the twinkling of an eye, transform you. So, although it's hard to see, it's kind of like the gorilla that we can't see, nevertheless, it's very close, and it can be quickly reached. The next one is about, it is not bound by space and time. But we've already talked about the converse of that, so I'm going to move on. The next feature of this world over here, we're going to call it the Rose Garden of the Spirit. You want to call it that from now on? Because that's in the first hidden word. He refers to it as the Rose Garden of the Spirit. And the reason I like to use that is that Abdu'l-Baha uses the term spirit to refer to 5 kinds of life. 5 kinds of life forms. Don't confuse this with the 5 kingdoms, which is the mineral kingdom. You know those kingdoms? Okay, or how many kingdoms are there? There's 4 kingdoms. But there's 5, what he calls classifications of spirit. You'll find it on page 144 of Some Answered Questions, but I'm not going to read all of it, because most of them are easily understandable. The first form of spirit, or life form, he says, is vegetable. And it's the form of life. And you have to agree that a vegetable has life. It has the power of growth. You know when it's dead or alive, and it is the first form of spirit. The second, he says, is the animal spirit. And there's no question that the animal has many more capabilities than the plant. It has the physical senses, it can travel, it can do things. It's a major step up from the vegetable. He says the third is man. And he goes on for a long time to explain how different man is from the animal. And although materialistic viewpoints now don't see as much difference in man as the animal as Abdu'l-Baha does, it's quite obvious that there are many things that man can do. His powers of thought, imagination, symbolism, language, overcoming his environment, all of these things. The animal doesn't even have 1% of these things. So it's quite clear that there is a huge jump from animal to man. So now we got 1, 2, and 3. Would you agree? Number 1 is vegetable or plant, and then number 2 is animal and man. I'm going to skip number 4 for a moment and go straight to 5. And 5 is the Holy Spirit. And that's pretty obvious that gets its own life form, wouldn't you agree? And he says the Holy Spirit is the emanation like the rays of the sun from God. And if you read it very carefully, it's the manifestation of God, or it's the form of God that we can recognize being the manifestation. And that's the 5th life form. So we got 3 out of 4. But this 4th one is the weird one. And he describes it in various terms. One of them, he says, it's the spirit of faith. But that's not a complete definition. He says, it is the this, it is the that, it is the spirit of faith. So now I'm saying, wait a moment, faith gets its own whole life form? You got animal, mineral, vegetable, and faith? I thought faith was just an attribute, like joy or patience or something. Patience says, gets mad, how come you get your own life form? How come faith gets its own life form? And yet Abdu'l-Baha says that faith is a new form of life. And it's the only form of life that can dwell in that world. Just like the physical man can only dwell in this world, the animal part of man, this other life can dwell in that rose garden of the Spirit. That's why it's called the rose garden of the Spirit, because the Spirit is a new form of life. Now, this is obviously what Christ meant when he said that if you have faith, you're born again. Clearly, that's what he meant. It's the same thing that Abdu'l-Baha is saying, that there is a new life created when you have faith. Now, the funny thing is that Abdu'l-Baha says that without this life form of faith, without it, we can't achieve anything. He says the human spirit, unless assisted by the spirit of faith, does not become acquainted with the divine secrets and the heavenly realities. So this is a serious matter. We want to dwell in the rose garden of the Spirit. And he says, without this new life form, faith, you cannot become acquainted with the divine secrets. Now, one might say, well, can't I just live a good life? Can't I just have virtues? Can't I do all the good things and not have faith? And of course, we read this in Baha'u'llah says, that there's twin duties. One is recognition and faith and manifestation, and one is observance of his laws. That faith is an absolutely essential quality to understand the spiritual world. But you still say, Abdu'l-Baha, why do I need to have faith? And so he answers that question in a very interesting way. He says that the mirror, although clear and polished, has no power unto itself unless you take it out into the sun. You can have a perfectly shined mirror and put it in a darkened room, and it, however clean it shines, it has no capability, because it must go out in the sun. I'm going to read this. He says, the human spirit, unless assisted by the spirit of faith, does not become acquainted with the divine secrets and the heavenly realities. It is like a mirror, which, although clear and polished and brilliant, is still in need of light. Until a ray of sun reflects upon it, it cannot discover the heavenly secrets. So I quickly said, okay, so basically what Abdu'l-Baha is saying is that faith is like a mirror. A mirror is a two-way process, or the action of a mirror, because something comes into it and it reflects back out. We normally think of faith as a one-way thing. And Abdu'l-Baha redefines faith as being a two-way process. Now, I was so pleased when I realized that the fourth life form is symbolized by Abdu'l-Baha by a mirror. I was very pleased by it because I was very, very upset with my research at this point, because there were two hidden words and they both said that you must do something first. And it so happens that the first Arabic hidden word says his first counsel is to possess a pure heart. And I'm very mechanistic in my thinking. Okay, that's the first thing you got to do. And then the first Persian hidden word says the first thing you got to do is dwell in the rose garden of the Spirit. And I'm saying, make up your mind, Baha'u'llah. What is the first thing I'm supposed to do? Then suddenly, I read from Abdu'l-Baha that the spirit of faith is like a mirror. And because of the way in which I conduct my research, anytime a symbol comes up, I think, what are the essential qualities of that symbol? The first thing we should always do when the writings use a symbol is, what are the essential qualities? And so you think carefully, what are the essential qualities of a mirror? And you say, well, a mirror requires two things. It requires two things. It must be unobstructed and clean and pure, and it must be taken out into something in the light. And either one without the other, the mirror can't function. So there are two things. There are two things you must do first. Do you understand? A mirror that's perfectly polished and pure, but in a darkened room, has no power at all. But a mirror that has dust and dirt and dross and everything, you take it out, also has no power to reflect. You need to do both. Consequently, the first two hidden words are telling you the two things you must do. If there was never a mirror that you saw, and you never had a mirror in your life, and you bought one, and it came with a user's manual, surely the user's manual would say, step one, make sure it's unobstructed and clean, and take it and face it something in the light. It would say those two things first. That would be. Now, the human soul also comes with a user's manual, and it's called the hidden words. And the hidden words says the first thing you need to do is have a pure heart and take it out into the rose garden of the Spirit. And by doing that, it gives birth to a completely new life form, as different as the animal is to the plant or man is to the animal. It's a new life form that's given birth, and it's the power of reflection. So now I challenge you to go home and look in Ocean and type the word mirror in there and see how many times the analogy of mirror is used to refer to men. And if we had a whole day, we could just read over and over again. And he says everything in creation is a mirror to a certain extent. Some things are more of a mirror than others. But of course, we couldn't see anything if it didn't have some reflection. So he says everything is a mirror of God, but man is a perfect mirror. Man is potentially a perfect mirror. A manifestation of God is a perfect mirror. Man has potentialities. And if you think of all the things that God uses to symbolize man in physical creation, man or life is usually symbolized by water or metallic things or gems. Gems are used to symbolize virtue, and gems are highly reflective. They're mirrors of exactly one color. And we're told that a gem is a virtue, and a virtue is a reflection of one attribute of God. Okay, we're told that man is very much like metal, like gold or silver, and it's highly reflective. Water is a symbol for life, and it's highly reflective as well. Many of the highest, most beautiful symbols in the writings are also mirrors. But we can't go into that too much. So basically, think of faith as a two-way process. And you have to now go to your dictionary and look up the word faith and cross out the definition. Okay, you just need to cross it out. Because some of us think faith is something that has no consciousness, that has no life. In fact, we say, just accept it on faith, or blind faith. And in one place, Adabaha says faith is conscious knowledge. It's a different word. Just don't even use it. That's why I like to say use the fourth life form. I want to have a new word so that we don't obstruct our thinking by language, because we're going to have to rewrite the language. The definition of faith has to be there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the last aspect of the spiritual world. And that is that to dwell in the spiritual world, it requires a certain measure of withdrawal from the physical world, a certain amount of sensory deprivation. Now, this is a really important subject. And how much time do I have before we take a break? We have 5 minutes, and then we have a 15-minute break? Okay. So then I'm going to move on into this, even though I won't be able to finish it. Baha'u'llah says that you have to not look at the physical world or not partake of it to a certain extent. I'll read a few of these. O son of dust, blind thine eyes that thou mayest behold my beauty. Stop thine ears that thou mayest hearken unto the sweet melody of my voice. Empty thyself of all learning that thou mayest partake of my knowledge, and sanctify thyself from riches that thou mayest obtain a lasting share from the ocean of my eternal wealth. Blind thine eyes, that is, to all save my beauty. Stop thine ears to all save my word. Empty thyself of all learning save the knowledge of me, that with a clear vision, a pure heart, and an attentive ear, thou mayest enter the court of my holiness. So he's saying, certain things, your eyes, your ears, your knowledge, you have to stop them to a certain extent so that you can have these other things. Now, he says, close one eye and open the other. Close one to the world and all that is therein, and open the other to the hallowed beauty of the beloved. He says, wouldst thou have me, seek none other than me, and wouldst thou gaze upon my beauty, close thine eyes to the world and all that is therein. For my will and the will of an other than me, even as fire and water cannot dwell together in one heart. Now, this is very interesting. You can't see one thing if you're looking at the other. And so you have to stop looking at the other. Remember in the inattentional blindness that it is not hard to see the gorilla. And you don't try to see the gorilla. All you have to do is stop counting the cars. And then suddenly, what's that gorilla doing there? Okay, isn't that interesting? And so Baha'u'llah doesn't say, try and see the spiritual world, he says, stop looking at the physical world. Because he knows if you do that, you will see it. So this means that there is some amount of sensory deprivation required. And when I say sensory deprivation, we too much please and satisfy our five senses. We overload them, and our five senses send signals through what we call the nerves into the brain, and the brain is full of it, and we're constantly bombarding. We bombard our senses in every way. And if we do this more than a certain amount, Baha'u'llah says, then we can't see the spiritual world. Now, he says that the best way to understand this is to meditate on what he calls the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men. He says you need to meditate on what he calls the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men. What is the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men? I think of all the signs of God that there are amongst men, and one of them, Baha'u'llah says, is the most mysterious of them all. And what do you think that is? And he says, if we meditate upon this particular thing, we will understand some of the concepts which I want to talk about sensory deprivation. Who can possibly guess what Baha'u'llah was referring to when he said the most mysterious signs of God amongst men? Who wants to? The soul? Okay, correct. He says it's dreams. He says, thy state when you're asleep. He says, consider thy state when asleep. Verily I say, this phenomenon is the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men. Were they to ponder it in their hearts. And then he goes on to explain all the things about dreams. In fact, in the 7 valleys, he said there is a myriad mysteries that can be revealed in the state of dreaming. Let me read a little bit of that, and we'll continue after the break. One of the created phenomena is the dream. Behold how many secrets are deposited therein, how many wisdoms treasured up, how many worlds concealed. Observe how thou art asleep in a dwelling, and its doors are barred. On a sudden thou findest thyself in a far-off city, which thou enterest without moving thy feet or wearying thy body. Without using thine eyes thou seest, without taxing thine ears thou hearest, without a tongue thou speakest. So first of all, it's quite obvious that we don't need the physical senses to see, to hear, to taste, to touch, and so on. That there is a world that can exist. So clearly dreams are proof of the existence of the other world, but that is only scratching the surface of what Baha'u'llah wants to get to. He then also says, perchance when 10 years are gone, thou wilt witness in the outer world the very things thou hast dreamed tonight. And so he basically explains that dreams are free of physical space, they're free of all physical matter, and even of time, they transcend. Now, that's not even close, because now there are many wisdoms to ponder in the dreams, which none but the people of this valley, this is the 7 valleys, can comprehend in their true elements. First, what is this world, where without eye and ear and hand and tongue, man puts all of these to use? Second, how is it that in the outer world thou seest the effect of a dream when it hadn't happened yet? I'm not going to read it on. Now, I want to explain to you some startling scientific knowledge about the physiology of dreaming. Because Baha'u'llah said to meditate and ponder on this mystery. And so the first thing we should do is see what science, and particularly in the 1960s and 70s when a lot of dream research happened, we know a whole lot about the physiology of dreaming, and it gives you tremendous spiritual insight into the most mysterious phenomena. So I will go immediately into that after we have a 15-minute break right now. Thank you. You've been very attentive. I really appreciate it. We were talking about the characteristics of the spiritual world, and one of the characteristics we found is that in order to dwell in the spiritual world, you need to deprive yourself of a certain amount of the physical world. And now I say a certain amount because you don't need to deprive yourself entirely of it. But Baha'u'llah says you need to somehow withdraw from a certain amount of the physical senses in order to partake of the spiritual senses. And then he says that one of the phenomena that's the most mysterious of the signs of God amongst men is the dream. And I'm going to read this a little more. He says, "Behold how the thing which thou hast seen in thy dream is, after a considerable lapse of time, fully realized. Had the world in which thou didst find thyself in thy dream been identical with the world in which thou livest, it would have been necessary for the event occurring in that dream to have transpired in this world at the very same moment of occurrence. Were it so, you yourself would have borne witness unto it. This not being the case, however, it must necessarily follow that the world in which thou livest is different and apart from that which thou hast experienced in thy dream. This latter world hath neither beginning nor end." Now he's talking about the dreaming world as if it's a real world, it's reality. Of course, a lot of us think dreaming is just some imagination, some creation of our mind. But Abdu'l-Baha, or this is actually Baha'u'llah, he refers to it as a place of reality that has no beginning nor end. He says, "It would be true if thou were to contend that this same world is as decreed by the all-glorious and almighty God within thy proper self and is wrapped up within thee. It would be equally true to maintain that thy spirit, having transcended the limitations of sleep and having stripped itself of all earthly attachment, hath by the act of God been made to traverse a realm which lieth hidden in the innermost reality of the world." This is what he says is true, that when you dream, your spirit transcends the limitations of the physical world. Stripped of earthly attachment, it traverses a realm which lieth hidden in the inmost reality of the world. And then he says, "Verily I say, the creation of God embraceth worlds besides this world, and creatures apart from these creatures." And he goes on to explain. So he says somehow, when you dream, you go to the real world. This is an irony of the dream, is because when we wake up from a dream, we say, "Oh, that was but a dream and now this is reality." But in fact, what actually happens is the reverse. "Oh, that was reality and this is now a dream." Okay, if you understand what I'm talking about. I don't want to blow your mind here, but that's really what happens every morning when you wake up. You say, "Oh my God, that was but a reality. This is a dream." Okay, you can't really say that, but that's really what Baha'u'llah is saying. Now, the interesting thing is that we know a lot in the last 40, 50 years about the physiology of dreaming, what happens in the body when we dream. First of all, we know by studying humans in laboratories, it's very easy to study dreaming because you just tell people to come and sleep in the laboratory and you put various scientific equipment on, you study them. We find that human beings sleep in an average 70-year lifespan. You sleep for 24 years of your life. You just take 8 hours a night, and you'll find that most people sleep around 24 years of their life. We're asleep 24 years of our life. Between 20 and 25% of that, we dream. We dream that much. We dream, between 20 and 25% of our sleeping time, which means that you dream between 5 and 6 years non-stop in your life. 5 and 6 years non-stop. Furthermore, we find that dreaming occurs only, or not only, I shouldn't say only, but predominantly in a certain stage of sleep. Sleep goes through stages. It's a 90-minute cycle, and you might have, 4 or 5 of those in a night. And those stages are characterized by certain physical conditions and certain brain waves and so on. They can be studied and analyzed. And in each of the successive stages leading up to dreaming, physical senses become turned off more and more. So if you go to the first stage of sleep, your sense of touch and your sense of hearing and your sense of vision are somewhat turned off, but not too much. So a certain sound you can't hear and you won't be woken up. and I touch you and you can't, and then you go into a lower stage of sleep, and then I can touch you a little harder and you won't wake up. I can make a sound louder and you won't hear it, and so on. Do you understand? Your physical senses are diminishing as you go through these stages, and you go through a third stage and your physical senses diminish even more, and you go to a fourth stage. Finally, you get to this last stage, and it's actually classified as paralysis. Your physical senses are virtually shut off. During this particular period of time, your sense of hearing is very, very limited. You can honk something louder and you can't wake something up. You can touch them harder and you can't wake them up. You can put a smell in the room. They've tried every sense, and all the senses fall to their lowest point at this one time, which is the stage that dreaming occurs. Now, this is very strange, because while they study the physical body, and they find that there is no way any sensory input can go into the brain from the physical world, because basically we know that the brain is active when it has sensory input. The optical nerve, in fact, 1/3 of the brain, I think, processes the optical nerve or something like that. But the optical nerve sends things, the hearing sends in and so the brain gets a lot of stimulus and is very active as it receives information from the five senses. And gradually these five senses become weaker and weaker until they're virtually turned off. In fact, scientists will tell you that during the period of time that you dream, the 20% of your sleep time, you are the closest thing to dead that you will ever be until you die, unless, of course, you go into some kind of comatose state or something like that. But you're very close to dead. Your physical senses are not working. Now you say, okay, that's interesting, but why would it be that this is when you dream? So originally, today they call the period of the dreaming sleep, they call it REM sleep. And that's because they found that your eyes move very rapidly, and as rapid eye movement stands for REM, and it's called REM sleep. But one of the earlier terms, which is still sometimes used, is they refer to this as paradoxical sleep. And the term paradoxical sleep was very commonly used in early dream research because in addition to studying the physical senses, they studied the electrical activity of the brain. You know, the brain, when it's active, actually sends little electrical signals, and these can be measured quite simply. And they find that as you doze off, the electrical activity slows down. Okay, and then you go to a second stage, and there's even less brain activity. And then you go to the third stage, there's even less activity. You go to the fourth stage, less. And then suddenly you get to this paralysis, and suddenly the brain becomes just as active and often more active than even waking. And they said this is paradoxical. That's why it was called paradoxical sleep. Because they said, how could it be that when you have nothing coming in from the physical senses, the brain is as active or even more active than it is in waking life? What is stimulating it? Where is it coming from? And of course, science can't answer this question. And they say call it paradoxical sleep. And of course, if you give a good name to something, then you think you understand it. But when you give a name paradoxical sleep, you're basically admitting that you don't understand it. But we understand what it is by what Baha'u'llah says, is that your soul is going there. And the soul can communicate with the brain, as Abdu'l-Baha says, through the common faculty. And so suddenly we realize that when you turn off the body, the spirit turns on. Because this is what happens every night. We can study it and learn it. And he says, this is one of the great mysteries of God. Every night you turn your physical senses off, your spirit roams. And suddenly we imagine that the brain is kind of like a train station. We'll call it Grand Central Station. A train station, or you can call it a brain station if you've kind of been... And you can think that this station has 5 trains coming in. Let's say they're coming in from the west. And these 5 trains that come in from the west are the sense of hearing, touch, smell, all the 5 physical senses. And they come into the brain all of the time. And then there's 5 trains that come from the east. I'm just making up east and west. And the 5 trains that come from the east, they come from a different realm. But Abdu'l-Baha says they come through this common faculty. And it appears as if, by scientific study, that as long as this train station is full of passengers getting off the 5 coming from the west, the eastbound trains don't come too much. They don't come too much. And then when they put the stop on the tracks and close the tracks down for the night, then all these eastbound trains say, oh, let's go and get into the station. And they go get in the station, and we can measure the activity. And so you can see it's like this. And so suddenly we realize that sensory deprivation, which is forced upon us physiologically by the sleep state, causes dreaming. Now, it's not always that you dream in that state, but majority of all dreams are in that what we call paradoxical sleep or REM sleep. Consequently, we know that sometimes when you deprive yourself a certain amount of physical sensation, you can use the spiritual powers greater. We have to stop some of those trains coming from the west and say, hold on, save some of the platforms for my eastbound trains. And how many of us are sending too many westbound trains into our brain station? How many are, we're putting, there's no room on the platform for these eastbound trains. And the only time it happens is when you're dreaming. Now, of course, many spiritual teachings are based on the concept that a limited amount of sensory deprivation will give you spiritual vision. For example, fasting is a fundamental principle of every religion and always was and always will be, according to Baha'u'llah. And fasting is nothing but just a small amount of physical deprivation. Not particularly much, if you have to agree. It's just a sense of taste or eating, and you're only not doing it while the sun is rising. And yet, it says here, fasting is essentially a period of meditation and prayer, of spiritual recuperation, during which the believer must strive to make the necessary readjustments in his inner life. He says, fasting is symbolic and a reminder of abstinence from selfish and carnal desires. So just the act of having a symbolic taking away of just a tiny amount of physical sensation leads to spirituality. How many of you felt the capability, your spirituality, just from not eating? Just the deprivation of one sense only part of the day, and yet for some reason it has an effect. So such like dreaming also causes that. Another one, Baha'i says, is that meditation, which is the ability to use the second spiritual power, the power of reflection. Remember we said that there's imagination, reflection, and so on. He says meditation can only function if you turn off the sense of hearing, of physical hearing. Okay, I'm going to read this because it's very important, because Baha'is are told we should meditate, and Baha'i has actually told us at least one of the things that is required for meditation. Baha'i says, Baha'u'llah says, there is a sign from God in every phenomenon. The sign of the intellect is contemplation, and the sign of contemplation is silence. Because it is impossible for a man to do two things at once. He cannot both speak and meditate. So when they say silence is golden, or the sounds of silence, or whatever, Baha'i is saying there is an enormous power in silence. He goes on to say, it is an axiomatic fact that while you meditate, you are speaking with your own spirit. In that state of mind, you put certain questions to your spirit, and the spirit answers. The light breaks forth, and reality is revealed. You cannot apply the name man to any being void of the faculty of meditation. Without it, he would be a mere animal, lower than the beasts. Through the faculty of meditation, man attains to eternal life. Through it, he receives the breath of the Holy Spirit. The bestowal of the Spirit is given in reflection and meditation. The spirit of man is itself informed and strengthened during meditation. Through it, affairs of man which he knew nothing of are unfolded before his view. Through it, he receives divine inspiration. Through it, he receives heavenly food. All of these things you can only achieve in silence. Total deprivation of one sense will only give you these things. And Baha'i says it's not even possible to get these things without meditation, and it's not possible to meditate without silence. Meditation is the key for opening the doors of mysteries. In that state, man abstracts himself. In that state, man withdraws himself from all outside objects. You see, sensory deprivation. He withdraws himself from all outside objects. In that subjective mood, he is immersed in the ocean of spiritual life and can unfold the secrets of things in themselves. To illustrate this, think of man as endowed with two kinds of sights. When the power of insight is being used, the outward power of vision does not see. This faculty of meditation frees man from the animal nature, discerns the reality of things, and puts man in touch with God. This faculty brings forth the invisible plane of the sciences and arts. Through the meditative faculty, inventions are made possible, colossal undertakings are carried out. Through it, governments can run smoothly. Through this faculty, man enters into the very kingdom of God. So it's a fairly powerful faculty, isn't it? The second spiritual power, which is the power of reflection. And yet Adi-Baha says it can only work in silence. How many of you even have silence in your life? Even a few moments. There's many people that don't. You know, Baha'u'llah, he loved nature. He went to the garden, what they call the Rezvan garden, and he was quoted as saying that the city is the place of the body and the country is the place of the soul. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact, you know, Beethoven, he lived in a very rural environment, just a tiny town, but he couldn't compose. He had to go out of there and into the woods before he could write. He went deep into the woods to compose. He had to get away from it all, and he already was away from it all. He had to get away from getting away from it all just to compose. But this is a particular power. So it's quite obvious that sometimes when you turn off the physical senses or deprive them to a certain extent, as in silence or as in fasting, that certain spiritual powers are awakened. Now, unfortunately, when I say this, I then have to immediately qualify it with one of the greatest Baha'i principles. And this principle is so important that it has to be stated here, even though it wastes time in the basic narrative of my talk. And that is that Baha'is are called on a principle of moderation in terms of limiting the physical world. There are some religions that they would take the quotations that I read you, like close one eye to the world and open the other, and they immediately say, well, let's completely forsake the physical world. Let's completely just forsake the physical world, because that's what that quote says. And indeed, if you read some quotes, it seems to imply that you do this. But we're told in the writings that we cannot do this. That is actually called asceticism, asceticism, and it's prohibited in the Aktas. That you cannot completely do this. Now, many religions have sects where they go and live in monasteries or live in caves or live on poles or they completely forsake the physical world in various ways. And we're prohibited from doing that as Baha'is. There's a new principle that Baha'u'llah has given, and it's the principle of moderation. But it's not widely understood by Baha'is because it's generally bandied around in too many ways. But Baha'u'llah has a very definite understanding of the principle of moderation. The principle of moderation says that there are some things that you should do and must do, and they are good up until a certain point, and then they are bad. It's not a good thing always. It's not a bad thing always. It's a good thing until you hit a certain point on a slider, and then it becomes a bad thing. And there's many things like this. He says, for example, civilization, so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences, will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. Thus warneth you he who is the all-knowing. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. Meditate on this, O people. So now he's identifying a principle that some things are good things, and then they become bad. And you have to find, like if you have a fader that goes from 0 to 100, and you go to 27 and it's good, and you go to 28, it's starting to get bad, and so on. Now, this is true in physical creation, in all things that we eat. Let's take salt, for example. Salt is something that today is the devil. If you read, don't have salt, it'll give you high blood pressure, it'll kill you, and so on. You have to agree, salt is like the big devil, and you cut down on salt and so on. Your doctor will tell you. Now, this is true. But in fact, salt is absolutely essential to life. And if you don't have it, you would die. And originally, salt was a very valuable thing. When you said you are the salt of the earth, that's because salt was valuable. The word salary means payment was because originally salt was so valuable that they paid soldiers in salt. Okay, so salt one time was the great thing, and now it's the devil. Why is it? Because we took it past the slider point of moderation. You cannot say, well, just cut out all salt. You will die. But you also can't say have too much. This is a very complex subject then, because there's some things you can't just do away with. Civilization is like salt, Baha'u'llah says. It's a source of good up to a certain point. You have to agree, is civilization a good thing? Yes, it's good. Is it a bad thing? Yes, it is. It's moderation that determines the point. Now, there are many things in this world that fall in that category that they have a slider point, and you need to figure out where that slider is. Baha'u'llah says, for example, fleeting are the riches of the world, and all that perisheth and changeth is not, and hath ever been worthy of attention. Now, if you just read that quote there, fleeting are the riches of the world, all that perisheth and changeth is not and has ever been worthy of attention, you might think, well, then we can just throw away the physical world. But what does he say? He says, has never been worthy of attention, except to a recognized measure. You see that? Everything in the physical world you can partake of to a recognized measure. Here's another quote. Shoghi Effendi in Citadel of Faith mentions the immorality of the world and the evils of the world. And he says one of them is the craving for pleasure and diversion. But I skipped one word. He said the inordinate craving for pleasure and diversion. Now this is very interesting. That one word makes all the difference. If Shoghi Effendi had said, one of the evils of the world is craving of pleasure and diversion, then the Baha'is would all say, well, we are not allowed to have any pleasure and any diversion, because Shoghi Effendi said pleasure and diversion is immoral. But Shoghi says inordinate. And inordinate applies that there's a certain amount, there's a place on the slider, and you don't go higher. And when you go past it, and so the term inordinate or recognized measure, these are all other terms for moderation. And so what things apply to moderation in the Baha'i writing? So you type moderation in the quote, and you find that civilization is one. Abdu'l-Baha says that your desire for food should be limited by moderation. He says you should content yourself with simpler foods, not as many different foods in one meal, and so on, moderation. Abdu'l-Baha says, interestingly, that teaching, particularly speech in relation to teaching, requires moderation. You say, no, hold on. We should just teach. Okay? And yet Abdu'l-Baha says that teaching requires moderation. If you speak beyond a certain amount or beyond their capacity, it is as much a source of evil as it was good. Now, would you say teaching is a good thing? Can teaching be a bad thing? If you go beyond moderation. He actually is it? Abdu'l-Baha says that capitalism and the desire to acquire profits is good, but if the acquisition of profits goes beyond moderation, it becomes evil. Isn't that interesting? He talks about capitalism. He says that the desire to acquire profits is okay, but then it becomes bad. Now, I think we went way past on the slider on that one, you see. Okay, Shoghi Effendi, he lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 things in Adult Divine Justice that apply to moderation and so on. So this is a very important principle, because this means we have to be mature. When I say here in this talk, you need to turn off and not look at the physical world, close one eye, I don't mean completely close it. Even though some quotes may seem like that, you have to take them in context. It means close it to the point where that slider belongs. Now, I don't know where the slider is, but you now need to look at everything in the physical world. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the time you spend, the things, and say, where is my slider on that? Is it at the point where it's something good for me? Or has it gone beyond that and it's now something bad for me? And put it there. And if you put the slider there for all things in physical creation, then you'll be able to see the spiritual world. It's that amount of deprivation, not more. So the principle of moderation, I had to mention. I'm sorry it took me away from my main theme, but otherwise you might have gone home and said, Tom Price said we have to forsake the physical world entirely. And that's not the case. But how many of you feel that perhaps you're gone beyond the moderation in many of the physical things? How many of you think we have? Of course. We're way, way beyond. So we can pull that slider down. But don't eliminate it. That's prohibited by Baha'u'llah, and that's actually dangerous. Now, fortunately, some things he's given us somewhat, he's told us where that slider is. For example, in terms of material wealth, he says that if you give 19 out of 100, 19% to God, that purifies the rest of it. He says that in the Akdas. He says it will purify your wealth. So fortunately, we know where money comes. Just give 19 to God, and that kind of purifies it. I'm not sure if that's the only thing, but at least he's given us some kind of indication. But so it's like 1/5. So you put it at 19. Okay, you put the slider. But I don't know what all the other things are. Entertainment and all the various things where the slider goes. But he helped us a little bit in that. Now, we now see we have the physical world and the spiritual world. And do you feel you have a better understanding of each? The nature of each? Has it in any way changed your frame of reference now about how you look at the world, that there's two out there? This is what we're trying to get at. Now, how do you get to that world? How do you get to that world? And so I look in the writings, and I find that the concept of getting to that world has to do with the concept of transcendence. And the concept of transcendence is in every religion. Transcendence means that you somehow transcend. You go from one state of existence to another. And Baha'u'llah says transcendence can be achieved primarily through two qualities. He doesn't actually say it that way, but if you look at it, and those qualities are eagerness and enthusiasm. It requires those two. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at all the things that make man, that anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, and so on look, that are unique to the human race, in other words, things that animals don't do at all, you could probably summarize them in 5 or 6 things. Each of them is an expression of transcendence. And let's look at some of the things that distinguish man. The first is what we call human consciousness. Human consciousness is something so unique to man. We say, I think, therefore I am, as if just your mere consciousness. Consciousness is a completely different being to the physical world. It transcends the physical world. The second characteristic that we find unique to man is the sense of imagination. Man has imagination, and the animals don't. Animals don't have this form of imagination. And it turns out that imagination is responsible for almost everything, all sciences, all arts, the man's ability to imagine. Imagining also is a transcending act of the physical world. Would you agree? You suddenly go to a place that has no physical thing. The third characteristic, which defines man, according to psychologists, is the sense of symbolism. For some reason, human beings are able to think something can represent something else. We have this ability. It's called the symbolic language. And of course, if you read, Jung or, Freud and all that, they basically, their whole understanding of the human nature is based on that we have a symbolic tendency. So you can take a photograph perfectly, in the highest megapixels, life size, and show it to any animal and they can't recognize it. If it's not the real thing, they don't know. But a human can look at, you can draw a hangman stick figure and say that's a man, and we can figure out that represents a man. And this symbolic ability is the only reason why we can create language. And that's why the animals don't have language, because they don't have the symbolic ability. Language is so fundamentally part of human nature that even babies will create their own language if you don't teach it to them. And unfortunately, sometimes babies are neglected, like in orphanages. And if two babies are similar age, and you leave them together, they will create their own language. One baby will do something and say blah, blah, and the other baby will remember that and do it and say it, and then gradually words just create. It's inherent in human nature to symbolize and create this. Is symbolism not transcendence from one thing to another? Another characteristic, they say, of human beings, another thing that's unique to human beings, is a sense of humor. Now, you may laugh at this. I'm joking. But you may laugh at it, but in fact, humor is a very, very serious subject and one of the most perplexing to psychologists. Still today, they don't understand it. It's very confounding. What is humor and why do people laugh? And so a lot of study has gone, and all the studies I've ever read on humor are extremely serious. There's nothing funny about them. But basically, what they have found is that all humor, whatever form of humor you have, it's based on pulling the rug out of one reality and causing another. In some form or another, humor is always based on transcending from one form of reality to another. And if you analyze the way in which humor is constructed or jokes, you have to understand, it's very difficult to explain this. But basically it could be that this word is used in one context and not another, or this is a meaning and it's not in another, or this is out of, this is not appropriate, or there's various ways in which humor can manifest itself. But all humor is based on transcendence of one frame of reference to a new one. And it's the suddenness of it, the suddenness of the transforming of the frame of reference, that for some reason causes you physiologically to smile and laugh. And it doesn't matter what culture, what background, what age you have, it's universally human that you like this sudden thing. And of course, if you read any textbooks on how to write humor or jokes, they train you to hide for as long as possible the one reality and keep it there so it's very sudden at the end. It's a bit of hanky-panky, if you know what I mean. Now, this is very interesting because studies have been done on even very small babies, and you don't even have to do studies. You can test it yourself. Take a small child, and they love to be surprised. And it's very strange, and this is true in any culture. You take a little baby, even just a few months old, you go hide behind a couch and you jump out and you go boo, and they laugh. Now this is very strange. Why do they laugh? And by the way, don't try it on any animal, okay? It doesn't work. Okay? Because they don't have this sense. But the little child laughs. Now, why does the baby laugh when you pull the rug from one reality to another? And then even more mysteriously, the baby laughs, and the first thing it does is say, "Do it again." And you say, how can I do it? How can I fool you again? Now you know. It doesn't matter. You can do it over and over and over again, and the baby likes it. It's inherent in human nature to want to transcend from one reality to another, and for some reason God has given us pleasure in this to such an extent that humor is an expression of transcendence. Now, there's a very wonderful letter that the House of Justice wrote to a believer, and you can look it up on the internet, in which the believer writes to the House and says, I understand from Persian or something that there's one tablet in which God is referred to as the humorous. How can this be so? And they write to the House of Justice. And the House writes back and says, well, there are certain meanings of humor that could apply to God. But if you think about it, God is by far humorous because basically He is showing us one world, and then when we die, He's going to reveal it, and we're going to have that same sense of pleasure that comes from humor. In fact, God is the most great humorist, and death is the most great punchline. Of course, I mean, it's very, very similar, because humor is based on transcendence. Humor is based on... he's going to say, I got you good, didn't I? Boy, did I get you. But why is that funny? Why do we like it when a frame of reference is suddenly changed? Why do we like to go to horror movies, or and be surprised? Why do we enjoy it? Why do we like plots that have a twist? Well, why is it that the human being takes pleasure in transcendence? It's because we need to transcend everything in the world, from dreamings as a phenomena, from humor, from imagination, from symbolism. It all teaches us that we need to transcend from one world to another. This is the fundamental call of religion, is to see the gorilla. If you understand what I'm talking about, to see that gorilla. Now, how much time do I have? I'm going to skip. I'm sorry? I have eternity, yes, that's right. I'm going to switch subjects just for a moment because I can't finish everything that I want to say. And I want to say that when we talk about frame of reference, and we talk about vision, and we talk about trying to change our frame of reference, I noticed when I looked at the life and work of Shoghi Effendi that this basically was his model in life. Shoghi Effendi was all about vision and all about changing our frame of reference. Have you noticed that about Shoghi Effendi? He tends to broaden your horizon. He tends to put things in perspective. Isn't that true? And so I was reading a little bit about Shoghi Effendi's early period as guardian, and I found there was one incident in his life that really showed how he had vision, how he had a certain frame of reference. And basically, I think that his life, in a way, is a symbol or a parable for the kind of things we need to do. And this is based on Shoghi Effendi's great love, his abiding love for mountain climbing. I don't know if you know, Shoghi Effendi loved to mountain climb, and he did so almost every summer. Rihakanim says almost every summer for the first 17 years of his ministry. He would go to the Bernese Alps, Switzerland, and he would either mountain climb or what they call mountain hiking, where we hike to the mountains. And I think apart from being guardian and being a genius and brilliant and everything else, apart from being guardian, this is the one thing that he loved. And his love of mountain climbing is very, very interesting. And I want you to think about this very carefully. Think about a 24-year-old. He was born in 97, and in 1921, he was only 24 years old. Think of some 24-year-old youth that you know. Okay, 24 years old. Abdu'l-Baha is passing away, and he says to the family in Haifa, because Shoghi Effendi is in London, send for Shoghi Effendi by telegram immediately. And the family disobeys Abdu'l-Baha. Says, let's not bother this little 24-year-old kid. And they write a letter. In those days, you write a letter, you forget about it. Okay? But Abdu'l-Baha specifically said, send a telegram to Shoghi Effendi. And Abdu'l-Baha passes away some weeks later, and had the telegram come, Shoghi Effendi would have had plenty of time with him. Shoghi Effendi loved Abdu'l-Baha so much that Abdu'l-Baha knew something. But also, Abdu'l-Baha was going to appoint Shoghi Effendi guardian. So Shoghi Effendi doesn't get this message because the family thinks Abdu'l-Baha doesn't know better. And Abdu'l-Baha passes away, and they realize they can't now send a telegram to Shoghi Effendi and tell him he's passed away. You couldn't do it that way. So they send a telegram to another Baha'i. And they say, can you please, call in Shoghi Effendi and tell him? So he calls Shoghi Effendi, can you come and visit me? He doesn't give any indication what's going to happen. And Shoghi Effendi comes to his office, and it just so happens that when Shoghi Effendi arrives and they usher him into the office, that he is down the hallway somewhere, not in the room. And Shoghi Effendi sits there, and he just sees on the table Abdu'l-Baha on a telegram upside down, because it was facing, and he sees that. And so he comes into the room and finds an unconscious Shoghi Effendi on the floor. An unconscious Shoghi Effendi was on the floor, and that's how he heard that Abdu'l-Baha had passed away. So he goes back to Haifa, and he says himself to Rihakanum, Priceless Pearl, that he thought maybe he might be asked to help unlock the safe or something, he might, because he was a family, he may have to sign some documents to transfer some kind of legal things as a family. This is what he thinks he may have to do, and his heart is broken. So he gets back to Haifa, and in early January of 1922, Abdu'l-Baha had passed away in November, they open the safe and they read it, and this 24-year-old student finds that the entire weight of the cause is on his shoulders, and finds out that Abdu'l-Baha had wanted to talk to him before he died, but had been deprived of this. And then immediately, the half-brother of Abdu'l-Baha goes and forcibly takes the keys to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. And he's a covenant breaker, because he claims family ownership, and now suddenly the most sacred relic of the faith, the very dust of Baha'u'llah's bones, is now in the hands of the covenant breaker, all within the space of a week. Shoghi Effendi, 24-year-old boy, tries to go to the government and explain it, but the government, they decide to take the keys away from them, but not give it to either one. Now, at this time, it was very hard for anyone to accept this 24-year-old, because most of the family were a whole generation higher than him. You imagine, you're 40, 50, and this youth suddenly takes over from Abdu'l-Baha, you don't understand. And so what they really wanted to do was that they tried to convince Shoghi Effendi to appoint the House of Justice. Okay? Rihakanum says, it does not require much imagination to conceive the terrible shock this was to Shoghi Effendi. The news arriving after dark by a panicked, excited messenger, and all the believers aroused and distressed by the words, because this is when the shrine of Baha'u'llah had been taken over. She says, the situation in which Shoghi Effendi found himself was truly crushing. Aside from his extreme youth, the beardless Oxford student, however dignified in his manner, refused to even pretend he was like the bearded patriarch everyone knew so well in Haifa. He didn't even try to be like Abdu'l-Baha. He says, Shoghi Effendi refused to wear a turban and the long oriental robes the master had worn. He didn't go to the mosque on Friday, the usual practice of Abdu'l-Baha. He refused to spend hours visiting Muslim priests, and so on and so on. She goes on to explain that everyone felt that Shoghi Effendi didn't really know what it was to be head of the faith. Okay? They said all of this added to his suffering and caused much alarm within the family. They secretly suspected that Shoghi Effendi did not really know what he should do, and that he needed an older and wiser head about him, and the sooner the House of Justice was formed, the better for the cause. During March of 1922, Shoghi Effendi then gathered a committee in the Holy Land. This was March of 1922. And basically, I'm not going to go into this detail, but he gathered a whole bunch of Baha'is, and he had been convinced, or they had said that unless you form some kind of body, you're never going to get the shrine of Baha'u'llah back, because they're not going to give it to some 24-year-old kid, but maybe if you form an organization, it's a body, you can get it back. But by this stage, Shoghi Effendi was completely overcome with grief. Abdu'l-Baha had passed away, he wasn't even there. Then the whole weight of the cause was placed on his shoulders, and then the shrine of Baha'u'llah was stolen from the Baha'is. And Rihakanum says, but the strain of this was more than he can bear. And so we find that on 7th of April 1922, the body enters the record that the guardian of the cause of God, the chosen branch, the leader of the people of Baha, under the weight of sorrows and boundless grief, has been forced to leave for a period of recuperation. And he left. Now, they wrote this on 7th of April, but Shoghi Effendi had already gone. It is not quite clear to me when he left, maybe in March or very, very early April. he left. And he wrote a letter to the Baha'is, and he said, "He is God. This servant, after that grievous event and great calamity, the ascension of His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha to the Abha kingdom, has been so stricken with grief and pain, and so entangled in the troubles created by the enemies of the cause, that I consider my presence here at such time and in such an atmosphere is not in accordance with the fulfillment of my important and sacred duties. For this reason, unable to do otherwise, I have left for a time the affairs of the cause, both home and abroad, under the supervision of the Holy Family, under the headship of the greatest holy leaf. May my soul be a sacrifice to her, until by the grace of God, having gained health, strength, self-confidence, and spiritual energy, having taken into my hands, in accordance with my aim and desire, entirely the regular work of service, I shall attain to my utmost spiritual hope and aspiration." Now, that letter arrived, but Ryakunim says he had already gone. He was long gone. And what happened was, they took him to doctors in Germany, and the doctors tested him and found that he had no reflexes. He had no reflexes, and it greatly distressed him. So he went to the Bernese Alps. And Ryakunim says he went there, and he was mainly alone, and he started to walk in the mountains. Very, very high mountains. And she said he would walk between 10 and 16 hours every single day. And for some reason, he found comfort in these mountains. Now, has any of you ever climbed tall mountains? There is something about the vision of reaching the summit of a mountain that cannot be achieved in any other way. I know, because I spent some time in my life in New Guinea, where we would climb mountains of 10, 11,000 feet, quite high mountains. And the interesting thing about the vision you get when you reach a mountain is that prior to reaching the summit, your vision is actually quite circumscribed quite often. You don't see much. And then suddenly you get to that top, and you look out, and it is amazing. You just want to put your hands out and spin like you're Julie Andrews in the Alps. I mean, you can't imagine the vision that one gets. So I think about Shoghi Effendi finding himself by going to these Alps. Now, she says that he went there so many times, and he lived in absolute poverty. He stayed in this tiny little place that you couldn't even get in. Shoghi Effendi was very short, and he only had one meal a day. He always traveled there third class and slept on the wooden planks of the train. In other words, total sensory deprivation, and he only spent the time in the mountains. And he did this until December. 9 months. 9 months. Now, sometimes the family would come and try and visit him, but they couldn't stay with him because he would take them walking for 10 to 16 hours, and they couldn't keep up with him. And he did it every single day. Now, Ryakunim says that virtually every summer for the first 17 years of his life, he returned back there. He needed to have this time of meditation and deprivation. And somehow he was able to find himself. And it so happens that I think in November, around November, December, he came back home from one of his long walks. Sometimes they weren't walks. He was actually roped to a professional, and they would drag him up the mountains. He even did those kind of things too. And he came back, and his own mother was there, sent by the greatest holy leaf, in tears, saying, "You've got to come back." And finally he did come back. And in the Star of the West, on December 15, so he left sometime in March or early April, so count it up, it's like nearly maybe 8 or 9 months. It says that December 15, in the Star of the West, it said, Shoghi Effendi returned to Haifa on Friday afternoon, December 15, in radiant health and happiness, and resumed the reins of office of the guardian of the Baha'i cause, committed to him in the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Now, he then started to write to the Baha'is. And he wrote many beautiful letters. I want to read you one letter he wrote fairly soon after he came back. It was written just about a year after he returned. I'm going to read this to you, and I want you to remember he's only 26 years old when he's writing this letter, and it was within a year of his returning. And I want you to think about him composing this letter in the mountains, because this letter is all about vision. And he writes to the Baha'is, "Surely now, if ever, is the time to turn our eyes inwardly, to bestir ourselves, to invoke the most great name, and standing together, summon to our aid and support all the faith, the strength and the courage that we shall need to meet our pressing obligations and discharge our trust. The plight of mankind, the condition and circumstances under which we live and labor are truly disheartening, and the darkness of prejudice and ill will enough to chill the stoutest heart. Disillusion and dismay are invading the hearts of peoples and nations, and the hope and vision of a united and regenerated humanity is growing dimmer and dimmer every day. Time-honored institutions, cherished ideals, and sacred traditions are suffering in these days of bewildering change from the effects of the gravest onslaught, and the precious fruit of centuries of patient and earnest labor is faced with peril. Passions, supposed to have been curbed and subdued, are now burning fiercer than ever before, and the voice of peace and goodwill seems drowned in unceasingly convulsions and turmoil. What, let us ask ourselves, should be our attitude as we stand under the all-seeing eye of our vigilant Master, gazing at a sad spectacle so utterly remote from the spirit which he breathed into the world? Are we to follow in the wake of the wayward and the despairing? Are we to allow our vision of so unique, so enduring, so precious a cause to be clouded by the stain and dust of worldly happenings, which, no matter how glittering and far-reaching in their immediate effects, are but the fleeting shadows of an imperfect world? Are we to be carried away by the flood of hollow and conflicting ideas? Or are we to stand unsubdued and unblemished upon the everlasting rock of God's divine instructions? Shall we not equip ourselves with a full and clear understanding of their purpose and implications for the age we live in, and with an unconquerable resolve arise to utilize them intelligently and with scrupulous fidelity for the enlightenment and promotion of the good of all mankind? Humanity, torn with dissension and burning with hate, is crying at this hour for a fuller measure of the love which is born of God. That love which in the last resort will prove the one solvent of its incalculable difficulties and problems. Is it not incumbent upon us, whose hearts are aglow with love for Him, to make still a greater effort to manifest that love in all its purity and power in our dealings with our fellow men? May our love for our beloved Master, so ardent, so disinterested in all its aspects, find its true expression in love for our fellow brethren and sisters in the faith, as well as for all mankind. I assure you, dear friends, that progress in such matters as these is limitless and infinite, and that upon the extent of our achievements along this line will ultimately depend the success of our mission in life. Shoghi Effendi. Isn't that amazing? He went to the mountains for 9 months, and came back and took every Baha'i to the mountaintop with such vision. It's remarkable to think that his writing style is almost as mature as anything he's ever written. Isn't that right? You don't see any arc of development or change in his writing style. He comes back somehow having found he had no reflexes. He couldn't take the reins of the cause of God. For 9 months he abandoned the cause of God. But somehow in meditation and sensory deprivation and finding vision on the mountains, he found the vision and the strength to come back and take the reins of the cause of God. Every single principle that we talked about in these 3 lectures, Shoghi Effendi did in those 8 months. And if you read more of it, you would have found he did every single of those things. It seems that the manifestations of God and Shoghi Effendi, even they need to get away and find the spiritual world. All the manifestations of God did something similar. If they need to do it, how much more do we need to do it? We think that, they could just do it. No. They had to find room 47B too. And it was hard for them. And Shoghi says that the most wonderful thing is that in 1957, just before Shoghi Effendi died, he went back to those mountains. And she said it was as if the mountains called him. And so the vision of Shoghi Effendi, for me from now on, the frame of reference of Shoghi Effendi will forever be linked to his going to the mountaintop and then bringing us to there. Now, it's a strange way for me to finish this talk, but I find that if you want to change your frame of reference, if you want to find the spiritual world, you can find it in this first year of Shoghi Effendi's life. Go back and read it. It's in Priceless Pearl, the early part of it, and you can find that everything that he did, you can do. Obviously, you can't be the guardian. But in our own way, we need to find our vision. We need to go to our mountaintop, as Shoghi Effendi did. And so I'm hoping that this brief 3 lectures has given you some change of a frame of reference, some vision of what you can do. But if we had more time, I would have talked more about some of the things Baha'u'llah said. In fact, Baha'u'llah identified 25 things you can do. Didn't I say that? And where did he identify those 25 things? In the Kitab-i-Khan, where he says, "Oh my brother, when the true seeker determines to take a path of search, he must before all else," and then he lists them. And I took them and I 25 things. If I'd had more time, I would have listed those 25 things. But then he goes on to say, do those 25 things, but it is in proportion to the eagerness of your search that you can achieve these things. In proportion to the eagerness of your search. So you can find room 47B and you can see that gorilla, but you need to have enthusiasm and eagerness. And I hope that all of us can make this journey. So thank you very much.